The research vessel, a sturdy ship named the Horizon, cut through the surf with steady purpose, its hull humming against the watery depths. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood near the bow, her sharp eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where a vague shape loomed, a dark mass that refused to settle into a known form. Behind her, the scattered murmurs of the expedition team blended with the creaking of rigging and the slap of waves against the ship's side. The air was thick with salt and anticipation, a cocktail of excitement and unease that clung to the skin and settled deep in the bones. Evelyn pulled her jacket tighter against the chill, dark hair pulled back into a practical knot that exposed the faint lines etched by years at sea. Her gaze never wavered from the outline ahead. This was the moment she'd chased for years, new discovery beyond the boundaries of the mapped world. Yet something gnawed at her, a whisper of doubt that grew louder with every nautical mile. Below deck, the cramped cabin was alive with the quiet buzz of equipment and conversation. Marcus Lynn leaned over a cluttered table strewn with digital maps, topographical data, and geological samples. His short-cropped hair was damp with sea spray, and the worn leather jacket he always wore seemed almost like armor against the unknown. He grinned at Lena Carr, who sat nearby, fingers tapping lightly on a notebook filled with scribbled glyphs and translations. "You really think this place will hold secrets worth risking our skins for?" Marcus asked, voice low but charged with excitement. Lena's pale eyes flicked up, her voice barely a whisper. "Something about it feels different, like it's waiting to be remembered." Evelyn joined them, her presence commanding yet tempered by the shadows of her own fears. "That's why we're here. To uncover what's been forgotten and to understand what defies knowing." The ship's captain, Jonas Reed, stood steadfast at the helm, his rugged face weather-beaten from decades at sea. His steady hands gripped the wheel, eyes scanning instruments and horizon alike. "We're sailing into a blank spot, Doctor," he said firmly. "No charts, no records, nothing." "Exactly," Evelyn replied, her voice steady but low. "That's what makes it real." As the ship drew closer, the island's shape sharpened, a jagged silhouette crowned with twisted trees and rocky cliffs. Yet on every digital map, every satellite image, and every historical record, it was as if the place simply did not exist. The data fed into their instruments returned emptiness, a void where the island should have been. The air around the island was unnervingly still. Even the gulls, which usually circled and called above such landmasses, were absent. A creeping silence seemed to ripple outward, swallowing the usual maritime chorus and replacing it with an oppressive hush. As the team prepared to make landfall, Evelyn's mind raced. This island was no ordinary place. It was a living mystery, a puzzle that threatened to upend their understanding of reality itself. She felt the weight of their mission settle on her shoulders, one of discovery but also of survival. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the deck as the Horizon anchored just offshore. The scientists gathered their gear, faces pale but resolute. They were about to step into a world uncharted, where the rules they knew might not apply, and where the silence promised more than absence, it promised oblivion. Evelyn glanced at each member of her team, Marcus with his restless energy and daring grin, Lena, quiet and watchful, clutching her notebooks as if they were lifelines, the captain, steady and unyielding, and the others, each carrying their own hopes and fears. Together, they would face the island's secrets and the terror that lay beneath its surface. The first step onto the sand was tentative, the strange soil cold and damp beneath their boots. The island breathed around them alive, watching, waiting, and as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the maps behind them remained stubbornly blank, refusing to acknowledge the place where they now stood. What was this place? How could it exist beyond the grasp of memory and record? And what price would they pay for seeking the truth hidden in the salt and the silence? The answers awaited just beyond the veil of the unknown. On deck, Dr. Evelyn Hart stood rigid, her sharp eyes sweeping the horizon where the island loomed like a half-remembered dream, its outline blurred by a gauzy veil of mist. The air was thick with salt and something else, an indefinable weight pressing quietly against the senses. Around her, the team prepared for the landing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Marcus Lynn paced near the bow, his worn leather jacket flapping in the sea breeze, eyes bright with that relentless hunger for discovery. Lena Carr lingered closer to the ship's railing, her pale face partially hidden beneath a curtain of light hair, whispering fragments of an old language she had begun piecing together. Even Captain Jonas Reed, rugged and stoic, scanned the island with a furrowed brow, skepticism hardening his features. "This place isn't on any chart," Marcus muttered, glancing at his handheld device that stubbornly refused to register the island's coordinates. No satellite data, no GPS lock. It's like it's off the map. Evelyn nodded, her fingers tightening around the strap of her field bag. "That's exactly why we're here. To understand what it is and how it exists in this liminal space." The landing craft bumped onto the coarse sand, the shore welcoming them with a strange softness. The beach seemed alive, shifting subtly beneath their feet as if the island breathed. The fog clung close, swallowing sound and blurring edges. As they stepped off, the distant roar of the ocean waves felt muffled, almost distant, like a memory fading in the back of the mind. Evelyn knelt beside a tide pool, her dark hair pulled back tightly to keep it from her face. Her fingers traced the smooth, wet stones, noting iridescent patterns shifting beneath the water's surface, colors that seemed to ripple and pulse, alive with an otherworldly glow. She pulled out her notebook, scribbling furiously, the scratching of pen against paper, the only sound she could trust. "Look at this," Marcus called from a few yards away, his voice sharp but low. He was scanning the tangled undergrowth, eager to push beyond the immediate shoreline. The terrain's shifting. The trees aren't where they were on the satellite images, if you can even call them that. Evelyn stood, brushing sand from her knees. "We need to be careful. This place doesn't follow normal rules." Lena approached silently, her eyes distant. "The sounds, they're fading. Even the birds have stopped." A sudden hush fell over the group, as if the island absorbed their voices. The usual chorus of wildlife vanished abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed on their ears and crawled beneath their skin. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if afraid to break the quiet. Captain Reed's voice cut through the stillness. "Stay alert. This silence isn't natural, it's a warning." The team set up a temporary camp near a cluster of jagged rocks, the fog swirling low and thick around them. Around the flickering campfire, Evelyn's voice was steady but strained as she dictated observations into a recorder, the mechanical hum a fragile lifeline against the growing quiet. Marcus leaned forward, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I want to push inland tomorrow. There's something here, something this island doesn't want us to find." Evelyn's eyes met his, a storm of doubt and determination clashing within her. "Then we proceed with caution. We document everything, no matter how small. This place resists being known." Lena's lips moved silently, whispering words long forgotten by history, names that no one else dared speak aloud. The island seemed to respond, the silence deepening, swallowing their voices and their memories before they could be fully formed. As night fell, The team lay restless beneath a canopy of stars. The oppressive quiet, a constant reminder that the island was not merely land, but a presence, an entity wrapped in salt and silence, waiting to erase all who dared trespass. The first glimpses of the island had revealed not just strange terrain or shifting landmarks, but a creeping terror that settled in the bones. It was a silence that spoke louder than any scream, a void that threatened to consume names, memories, and identities. And as the scientists drifted into uneasy sleep, none could shake the feeling that the island was already watching, already beginning its work. Evelyn's last thoughts before the darkness claimed her were of the fragile thread that held them all together, the names, the words, the stories. If those could be lost, what remained? And could they fight back against the silence that sought to swallow them whole? The island answered only with the sound of the tide, washing away footprints and whispers alike. The day had begun with hope and purpose. But as the team's first steps sank into the shifting sands, the island's true nature began to reveal itself, elusive, dangerous, and utterly silent. Evelyn's obsessive note-taking became a desperate act of resistance, while Marcus's restless energy threatened to unravel the fragile order. And beneath it all, the silence crept closer, a tidal force of erasure that no one yet fully understood. The expedition had crossed a threshold. The island had accepted them not as visitors, but as potential sacrifices to its endless hunger for forgetting. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood with her clipboard, the pale light catching the sharp planes of her face, shadowed by the dark hair pulled taut against the morning breeze. Around her, the others fidgeted with equipment or exchanged wary glances. Marcus Lynn crouched nearby, tracing lines on his battered map with a finger, brows furrowed in frustration. Lena Carr hovered at the edge of the clearing, her pale face almost swallowed by the light strands of hair that fell over her eyes. The island had already begun to assert its strange dominion. Where is it? Marcus's voice cut the silence sharply. The tree was right here yesterday. Evelyn's eyes scanned the space, but the large tree was gone. In its place lay a hollow, a shallow depression in the soil where roots might have once clung. The earth was undisturbed, no sign of a toppled trunk or broken limbs. It was as if the tree had never existed. "This can't be," Evelyn murmured, her voice tight. She tapped her clipboard, checking coordinates. Then her gaze flicked to a GPS device that blinked uncertainly. The instruments confirmed the location. We documented it clearly. Lena stepped forward, voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes things that are lost need names to exist. The others turned toward her, uncertain. She knelt on the damp soil, tracing a delicate finger in the leaf litter as she murmured soft syllables, words no one recognized. Guttural, yet strangely melodic, ancient tongues that seemed to resonate with the very earth beneath them. The air around her felt colder, charged with fragile hope. "What are you saying?" Marcus asked, skepticism in his voice. "Names," she replied simply. "Lost names. If we do not name the things we see, they disappear." Evelyn's analytical mind wrestled with the possibility. The island seemed to resist the scientific method, a living enigma that defied the laws she had trusted for decades. She glanced at Marcus, whose jaw was clenched tight with frustration. "We can't afford to chase ghosts," he snapped. "We need data-stable, consistent data. This is madness." "And yet," Evelyn said quietly, "the evidence is right in front of us. The island is not static. It shifts. It erases. We have to adapt." Tensions simmered between them, a fragile balance of authority and doubt. Elsewhere, Captain Jonas Reed stood aboard the ship, his gaze fixed on the shore, now wreathed in a creeping fog that swallowed the horizon. His weather-beaten face was a mask of stoic concern, the pragmatic mariner wary of the island's growing strangeness. Back on the island, Dr. Samuel Ortiz paced near the boundary of the clearing, adjusting his glasses as he observed the group's disarray. "This place plays tricks on the mind," he said, voice low and measured. "We must guard against paranoia." But paranoia was already taking root. Landmarks they had depended on vanished or warped between visits. Paths mapped with painstaking care twisted into unfamiliar trails. Even the sky seemed to shift, the sun's angle warping subtly, confusing their sense of time. Lena's whispering continued, a desperate litany against the encroaching silence. With every name she breathed into the wind, some features held their place a little longer. The island, it seemed, could be momentarily anchored by language, but the reprieve was fleeting. "I don't know how much longer we can hold on," Evelyn confessed one evening, the pale glow of her recorder illuminating her worn face as she documented the day's findings. "If the island wants to erase us, it will." Marcus slammed a fist into a boulder, his frustration boiling over. "We need to push forward, map every inch before it changes again. If we stop, we're lost, and if we push too hard," Lena asked, voice trembling, "we risk losing ourselves in the silence." The island was a predator, patient and unyielding. It consumed not only the physical but the intangible, memories, names, the very essence of identity. The team's unity frayed under the strain of the vanishing world around them, each step forward a battle against oblivion. As twilight deepened, the clearing where the ancient tree once stood was swallowed by shadows. The land seemed to hold its breath, a silent witness to the scientists' desperate struggle. And beneath the creeping silence, the island waited enchanted, unyielding, and alive in its erasure. "We're not just mapping geography anymore," Evelyn whispered to herself, voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "We're mapping oblivion." A cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of forgotten name, a lost memory, a warning from the silent depths of the island itself. The team's journey into the unknown was only just beginning, and the shadows of vanishing landmarks stretched long into the night. In the muted light of the island's clearing, Dr. Evelyn Hart was reviewing her notes when a sudden, chilling disturbance rippled through the camp. A quiet murmur rose, fragmented and uncertain. It was Lena who noticed first. She knelt beside Dr. Samuel Ortiz, who stood frozen at the perimeter of their makeshift camp, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Samuel," she whispered, stepping closer, her voice barely audible against the gentle rustle of the island's strange foliage. He turned to her, his brow furrowed, lips parted as if about to speak, but no words came. "Samuel, what's wrong?" Evelyn called out, her voice sharp with urgency as she hurried over. The others gathered quickly, their faces pale and strained, reflecting the unease that had taken root overnight. When Evelyn reached him, she heard the tremor in his voice as he finally spoke. I can't remember. My name." The words hit like a thunderclap. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, as if the island itself was swallowing sound whole. Everyone stared at Samuel, disbelief and fear knitting their brows. Marcus stepped forward, his usual confident swagger replaced by a tense, jittery energy. "That's impossible," he said, eyes scanning the psychologist's face for signs of a trick or a breakdown. "You're joking." But there was no humor in Samuel's gaze, only a vacant confusion that chilled Evelyn to her core. She pulled out her notebook, fingers trembling, and flipped the page where she'd recorded each member's name and function. "Samuel Ortiz," she read aloud softly, then looked back at him. Do you remember this? He shook his head slowly. No, nothing. The camp erupted into whispers, some skeptical, some terrified. Captain Jonas Reed barked an order to regroup, his voice a rare anchor of authority in the mounting chaos. Everyone, stay calm. We don't know what's happening, but panic won't help. Evelyn's mind raced. This was more than a psychological breakdown. It was the island's influence manifesting in its most insidious form. A creeping erasure that was not just physical but mental, targeting the very essence of identity. The tides here didn't just wash away footprints, they swallowed memories, names, the self. Marcus was pacing near the shoreline, hands jammed into the pockets of his worn leather jacket, his jaw clenched. This isn't some cosmic fluke, he muttered, voice low but edged with frustration. We can't keep relying on traditional science to explain this. The island's messing with our brains, our realities. Evelyn approached, her expression tight but resolute. We stick to the data. Panic clouds judgment. We document everything. That's our only anchor now. Words and notes won't save us if the island keeps erasing us. Marcus snapped back, eyes flashing with desperation. We're losing ground, fast. Tensions flared, the team fracturing under the pressure of an enemy they could neither see nor fight conventionally. Evelyn's leadership was tested like never before. Her voice rose above the murmurs as she tried to rally her team. We need to name everything ourselves. The island's features, our findings. Naming is resistance. Don't forget who you are. But even as she spoke, the silence deepened. Conversations faltered, words became labored, and an oppressive stillness settled over the camp. The island's fog thickened, swallowing sound and light, erasing not just the voices, but the very memory of speaking. That night, the team huddled close, whispering names and fragments of their pasts to stave off the encroaching void. Evelyn's hands trembled as she scribbled notes by the flickering light of their lantern. Each word a desperate plea against the tide of oblivion. Outside, the waves lapped silently against the shore, indifferent and eternal. The island waited, patient, its erasure creeping closer, promising to consume not just their bodies, but the stories that made them who they were. And somewhere in that creeping silence, the first name was lost forever. The tide had shifted again, creeping in with an unnatural softness that swallowed the jagged edges of their camp. Evelyn's eyes scanned the horizon, the salt wind whipping strands of dark hair across her sharp features. She felt the weight of the island pressing against her, a silent force that seemed to pulse with each crashing wave. Look at this, Marcus called from the edge of the clearing, crouched beside a cluster of rocks. His voice was tense, breath coming in short bursts. The tide's taken the markers we set up yesterday. It's like the island is erasing us. Evelyn stepped closer, noting how the sand where their footprints had been just hours before was now smooth and untouched, as if no one had walked there. The usual sharp scent of salt was tinged with something else, an indistinct trace of damp earth and something metallic, almost like dried blood. Lena approached silently, her pale face partially hidden beneath a loose hood. She carried a small notebook, its pages worn and smudged. It's not just the physical, she whispered, voice barely audible over the gentle roar of the surf. I can feel it in my mind, the memories slipping away, names dissolving into the mist. Evelyn nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The island wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, one that devoured identity and presence alike. The team had lost time, sometimes hours at a stretch, and with it, fragments of themselves. But today, Lena had something new. She knelt beside a peculiar rock formation coated in glistening salt deposits. Her fingers traced strange, weathered carvings, symbols that seemed to resist the island's erasure. "These markings," she said, "they are names. Names that hold power here." Marcus frowned, skepticism flickering in his eyes. "Names? You mean like labeling stuff?" "More than that," Lena replied, voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "I think naming these places anchors them, anchors us. It slows the forgetting." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "Then we have to name everything. Every tree, every rock, every path. If it slows the island's hunger, we use it." Captain Jonas Reed emerged from the shadows of the trees, his weather-beaten face drawn tight in concern. "Sounds like fighting ghosts with names," he muttered, scanning the restless waves. "But if it keeps us from disappearing, I'm all for it." The team split up, voices rising in a chorus of whispered names that tangled with the wind. Evelyn called out names for the trees, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Marcus marked the shifting terrain with hastily drawn signs and shouted out designations for landmarks that seemed to shimmer, just beyond reach. Lena moved methodically, her voice low and rhythmic as she repeated ancient words she'd deciphered from the carvings. The island's silence seemed to hesitate, a faint tremor in the air, as if uncertain how to respond. But the tide was relentless. It crept closer, lapping at their feet, chasing away the traces of their existence. Equipment vanished, memories blurred, and a cold panic settled in Evelyn's chest. Her hands trembled as she jotted notes, lines of frantic script that grew more chaotic with each passing hour. "We're fighting time itself," she murmured, eyes darting to the horizon where the fog thickened. The island whispered secrets in the hush between waves, a soundless voice that gnawed at the edges of their minds. Yet, in the act of naming the defiant utterance of words, the team found a fragile thread of resistance. Each name spoken aloud was a spark in the gathering dark, a flicker of identity against the encroaching void. But the cost was clear. The effort drained them, and the island's erasure pressed heavier with every breath. Captain Reed's voice cut through the tension as he barked orders to reinforce the camp. The water's edge crept nearer, threatening to wash away their shelters and the thin safety they clung to. "We hold here, or we lose ourselves," Evelyn said, voice steely despite the exhaustion gnawing at her. The struggle was far from over. The salt and silence converged in an endless tide, pulling them toward oblivion. Yet, as the team bound themselves with language and memory, a fragile hope shimmered beneath the surface. Perhaps names could be weapons, and words the last refuge against a terror that would erase all traces of their being. Dr. Evelyn Hart sat hunched over her journal, fingers clutching the pen as if it might ground her to the reality slipping away. Outside, the island's silence pressed against the thin walls, a creeping void that seemed to suck the sound from the air itself. Each breath she drew felt heavier, weighted with the knowledge that the memories of her team, their names, their histories, were dissolving like salt in the tide. She glanced up as a soft knock echoed from the entrance. Dr. Samuel Ortiz stepped in, his pale face shadowed by the dim light. His glasses caught a faint gleam before he removed them, rubbing tired eyes. "Evelyn," he began, voice low but edged with exhaustion, "we need to talk." She nodded, motioning toward a cluttered table strewn with maps and data pads. "What is it, Sam?" Ortiz hesitated, swallowing hard. I'm starting to question everything we thought we knew. The island's influence, it's not just physical. It's psychological, yes, but it defies all rational explanation. I've been trying to hold on to skepticism, to reason it out, but..." He trailed off, gaze flickering to the fogged window where shadows shifted ominously. Evelyn's jaw tightened. We all feel it. The silence, the forgetting, but science is our anchor. We can't let fear fracture us. Ortiz shook his head. I'm not sure we have a choice anymore. Last night, I found myself staring blankly at my own reflection. I forgot my age, my family, everything that made me who I am. If this is some supernatural force, it's beyond any psychological framework I've studied. The confession hit Evelyn like a blow. She had suspected the worst, but hearing it confirmed shattered her fragile resolve. We need to find a way to fight it, she said firmly. If memories are slipping away, then we must anchor ourselves through language, through ritual. Lena's work might hold the key. Just then, the door creaked open and Marcus Lynn strode in, his leather jacket slightly damp from the mist outside. His eyes were wild, fingers twitching nervously. "Did you hear that?" he demanded, voice sharp. The ground shifted again near the northern ridge. This place isn't just erasing who sits alive, messing with our heads. Ortiz shot him a look. Marcus, reckless as always. We don't know what we're dealing with. Charging into the unknown won't help. Marcus bristled but said nothing, his gaze drifting to Evelyn, silently pleading for guidance. The tension in the room thickened, a fragile web of trust stretched thin. Meanwhile, Lena Carr sat in a corner, fingers tracing the edges of a weathered notebook. Her pale face was drawn, strands of light hair falling over her eyes as she whispered words no one else understood. Fragments of a lost language she believed could stave off the erasure. "Naming is resistance," she murmured, voice barely audible. "To name is to remember." Myra Chen and Eli Turner exchanged worried glances nearby, the strain of the island's silence settling over them like a shroud. Nia Brooks, the assistant linguist, shivered in place, her growing fear mirroring the team's unraveling sanity. Outside, Captain Jonas Reed paced the perimeter of camp, his rugged face set in grim lines. Years at sea had taught him to read the signs of danger, and the island whispered warnings in every rustle and shadow. Yet no amount of experience could prepare him for the invisible erosion gnawing at the minds of his crew. As night deepened, the camp fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the scratch of Evelyn's pen and the occasional muffled whisper from Lena's corner. The island's creeping influence was no longer subtle. Memories flickered and vanished. Paranoia blossomed like a toxic flower. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Evelyn confided in Ortiz, "We're losing ourselves. I don't know if any of us will make it out intact." Ortiz nodded slowly, the skeptic's armor cracking. Perhaps the only way to survive is to accept what we cannot understand. But acceptance felt like surrender, and surrender was the last thing Evelyn could bear. The island held them in its silent grip, fracturing minds and unraveling bonds. As the night stretched on, the question lingered how long before the silence consumed them all. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing sound and light. Somewhere in the distance, a faint whisper slipped through the darkness, an echo of forgotten names and lost souls, beckoning the expedition further into the abyss. And beneath it all, the island waited, patient and eternal, to erase what had dared to trespass. Marcus Lynn was already moving ahead, his worn leather jacket brushing wet leaves as he stepped deeper into the forest. His movements were purposeful, almost reckless, a stark contrast to the measured caution Evelyn Hart tried to impose on the team. "Marcus, wait," Evelyn called, her voice taut with urgency, but the geologist did not slow. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous mix of curiosity and defiance, the kind that had fueled his every reckless choice since joining the expedition. The forest around him seemed alive, but not in any natural way. Trees twisted subtly, trunks bending and straightening like slow breathing. Paths that had been clear moments before had vanished, replaced by patches of bramble or shifting moss. Marcus's boots sank slightly into the ground, which felt less solid than it ought to be, as if the soil was breathing beneath his feet. A soft rustle echoed from behind a copse of gnarled trees, and Marcus froze. The air was thick with a creeping silence, but beneath it, faint whispers seemed to ripple through the leaves, whispers that made the hairs on his neck stand upright. Evelyn watched from the edge of the clearing, her pulse quickening. The island's power was intensifying, and Marcus was pushing into its heart without heed. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe steadily as visions from her past flickered unbidden. Her mentor's face, pale and lifeless, lost to an expedition much like this one. The guilt that had driven her here now gnawed at her resolve. "Marcus, come back," she shouted again, voice cracking with a mixture of fear and command. But the forest swallowed the words, and Marcus was gone from sight. The radio crackled to life on her belt, the static thick like a wall. Marcus's voice filtered through, broken and distorted. "Evelyn, something's wrong." The ground, then silence. Evelyn's heart hammered. "Marcus, respond." She grabbed the radio, her fingers trembling, but only static answered. The island was interfering with their technology, severing the tenuous links they had with each other. "We have to find him," she said, her voice low but resolute. "Now." Captain Jonas Reed nodded grimly, rallying the remaining team members. Lena Carr's pale face was drawn tight with worry, her light hair falling over her eyes as she muttered forgotten words under her breath, a ritual she hoped might anchor them against the island's encroaching silence. They moved cautiously into the forest, the terrain twisting in ways that defied logic. A rock that had been solid moments before seemed to ripple like a mirage. A tree bent impossibly, its branches stretching and retracting like limbs of some great, unseen creature. Evelyn's mind raced. The island was not merely a place, but a sentient force, a manifestation of forgotten histories and erased identities. It was reshaping itself, and with it, the very reality the team depended on. As they pressed deeper, Evelyn's thoughts drifted to the mentor she had lost, Dr. Harold Crane. His disappearance had haunted her for years, a shadow she had hoped to outrun here, but the island was forcing her to confront that darkness head-on. She felt the weight of every failure, every loss, as if the island fed on her guilt. Suddenly, a scream shattered the silence, raw and desperate. Evelyn spun toward the sound, heart in her throat. Marcus stumbled into view, eyes wide with terror, clothes torn and mud-streaked. I got turned round," he gasped. The ground, it shifted. "I thought I was going to fall in forever." Evelyn rushed to his side, gripping his arm. "We need to move, now. The island's changing too fast." Marcus's bravado had cracked, replaced by raw fear. But even as they retreated, the forest seemed to close behind them, paths disappearing and reappearing like a living maze. Back at camp, the team gathered, faces pale and drawn. The incident had fractured their fragile sense of safety. Evelyn's leadership now bore the heavy burden of keeping them together against an enemy that was not just external, but existential. That night, as the island settled into a deep, suffocating silence, Evelyn sat alone outside her tent. The weight of the day pressing down, she pulled out her journal, fingers trembling as she wrote, "The island shifts beneath our feet, Not merely land, but memory and identity itself. Marcus's recklessness nearly cost him his life. I feel the past closing in, the ghost of Harold watching, reminding me of what's at stake. We are caught between science and oblivion, and I fear which will win. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a silence so deep it felt like the end of everything. Evelyn's eyes closed, but sleep would not come. The island was watching, waiting, and the tide of erasure was rising. She was determined not to be lost to its depths, not yet. But the struggle was only beginning. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, the island breathed around them, alive and indifferent, a shifting terrain of terror that would test every ounce of their resolve. And Marcus sat quietly by the fire, the leather jacket replaced by a damp shirt, his gaze distant. The island had touched him, changed him, and the reckoning was far from over. Evelyn's voice broke the morning stillness. We need to map what we can, name it, anchor ourselves, or we will all be swallowed. The words hung in the air like a fragile promisor, a desperate plea. Outside, the forest pulsed, waiting for their next move. Beneath a canopy of twisted branches, Lena Carr crouched, her fingers trembling as they traced the faint carvings etched into the bark of a gnarled tree. The symbols were jagged, half-forgotten shapes that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim glow of her headlamp. She whispered the strange words beneath her breath, careful not to break the fragile thread of sound that tethered her to reality. "They're fragments," she murmured, voice barely audible even to herself. "Pieces of a language, lost to time." Around her, the camp lay shrouded in creeping fog, the oppressive silence thick enough to choke the night air. Elsewhere, the others moved like shadows, Evelyn pacing near the shore, her dark hair whipping in the salty breeze. Marcus, restless and agitated, his leather jacket soaked from an earlier exploration. Captain Reed, vigilant and unyielding, standing guard where the sea kissed the jagged rocks. Lena's breath hitched as she pieced together the snippets of language, a tapestry woven from forgotten tongues and erased memories. These were not merely words, they were the island's story, whispered in silence, carved into its bones. The island was a vessel, a mausoleum for vanished peoples and lost histories. It was alive, sentient, preserving itself through erasure. Evelyn approached quietly, eyes heavy but sharp. "What have you found?" Lena looked up, pale face framed by strands of light hair. "It's a language of forgetting and preserving. The island remembers by forgetting. It stores the past by erasing it from the world." Marcus joined them, skepticism and fear warring in his gaze. "So it's a trap, a tomb." "More than that," Lena whispered. "It's a guardian. It protects itself by swallowing those who come too close, by unmaking their histories." A sudden chill swept ashore as fog rolled in thicker, swallowing the sound of waves and footsteps alike. From the mist, spectral silhouettes flickered, ghostly shapes that seemed to drift just beyond the veil of perception. Evelyn's heart pounded, her scientific resolve cracking under the pressure of the unknown. "We're not just visitors," she said, voice low. "We're trespassers in something ancient and terrible." Captain Reed's voice cut through the mounting tension. "We need to hold fast. Understand it, or we don't leave at all." Back at the camp, Lena gathered the team, her voice steady despite the dread that clung to her words. She shared the fragments of the lost language, the whispers embedded in the island's soil and stone. The team listened, enraptured and horrified, as the island's nature unfolded before them like a dark bloom. The silence around them deepened, no longer empty but filled with the weight of forgotten names and erased memories. The island was not merely erasing their presence, it was rewriting reality itself. Each word Lena spoke seemed to push back the silence, momentarily anchoring their identities against the tide of oblivion. Yet with knowledge came terror. The island's sentience was no longer a distant mystery, but a palpable force, watching, waiting. The team's fragile grasp on their reality wavered, the boundary between memory and nothingness blurring like the fog outside. In the quiet moments between revelations, Lena whispered the island's lost words again, each syllable a plea for survival. The night stretched on, endless and oppressive, as the island listened and remembered, and the scientists faced the chilling truth that to know the island was to risk being unmade by it. But even as the silence crept closer, a spark of understanding had been kindled. The island's language was a key, fragile and imperfect, but a key nonetheless. And for the first time, the team clung to the hope that naming the unnameable might be their only defense against the erasure consuming them all. Outside, the spectral silhouettes shimmered like forgotten ghosts, and the tide whispered its eternal secret. The island waited, patient and merciless, as the scientists whispered back, desperate to be heard in the silence. The night was far from over, and the island had many more secrets to reveal. But for now, amidst the creeping silence, Lena's words echoed a fragile defiance against the void, and the island listened. Captain Jonas Reed stood on the deck of the expedition ship, the salt wind biting through his naval coat as his gaze remained fixed on the eerie silhouette of the island. It was an island that no chart dared to mark, a landmass that seemed to exist just beyond the grasp of reason and, now just beyond the reach of memory. Reed's weather-beaten face was set in a hard line, his eyes narrowed against the creeping fog that swallowed sound and light alike. Around him, the murmurs of the crew fluttered like nervous birds, their voices low and uncertain. The ship rocked gently, a lullaby of unease that echoed the growing tension within the team. Inside the cramped lab, the atmosphere was far from calm. Dr. Evelyn Hart's sharp features were drawn tight with frustration as she clutched her well-worn notebook, the edges frayed from constant use. Across from her, Dr. Marcus Lynn leaned forward, his worn leather jacket creaking softly with the motion. His eyes burned with restless energy, a wildfire barely contained beneath his calm exterior. "We can't just sit here and wait for this island to erase us," Marcus snapped, voice low but fierce. "We have to push further, map every inch before it's too late." Evelyn's gaze flickered with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "And risk losing ourselves completely. That's reckless, Marcus. We need to understand what we're dealing with before charging blindly into its maw." Their argument was a sharp contrast to the silence pressing in beyond the lab walls, a silence that was not merely the absence of sound but a presence, a force that gnawed at their minds and memories. Nearby, Lena Carr sat cross-legged on a smooth rock near the shoreline, her pale fingers tracing invisible patterns in the damp sand. Her light hair fell in soft curtains around her face, partially obscuring the flicker of hope and fear in her eyes. She whispered the fragments of a language that seemed as old as the island itself, a fragile thread she clung to against the tide of oblivion. "Namelessness is the enemy," she murmured, voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of unnatural tides. "If we forget the names, we forget what we are." In the dim common room, Dr. Samuel Ortiz paced restlessly, his thin frame casting long shadows in the flickering lantern light. His glasses caught the glow, momentarily revealing the sharp intellect behind his pale, guarded expression. Yet tonight, his usual confidence was fractured, his skepticism wavering beneath the relentless pressure. All this talk of supernatural forces, Ortiz muttered to himself, voice tight with disbelief and something darker fear. It's just our minds breaking down. We can't let this island win by surrendering to superstition. But as the night deepened, even Ortiz's doubts felt like fragile defenses against an encroaching void. Captain Reed finally broke the silence, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Enough of this," he said firmly, stepping into the lab where Evelyn and Marcus were still locked in their heated debate. "This island isn't some puzzle to solve with charts and theories. It's a trap. And if we don't start thinking about getting off it, we'll lose more than just our minds." Evelyn's eyes met his, a flicker of respect mingled with frustration. "We're not giving up, Captain. Not yet. There's something here worth understanding." Reed shook his head slowly. "What's worth understanding if it means we vanish from existence? We can't fight silence with words. Sometimes survival means knowing when to let go." The room fell into a tense quiet, broken only by the distant, unnatural rhythm of the island's tide. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing sound and light with an almost sentient hunger. That night, paranoia crept into the corners of their minds like a corrosive mist. The team's cohesion frayed as fear took root. Marcus's reckless pushes into the shifting terrain left him exhausted and haunted. Evelyn's obsessive recordings became both a lifeline and a curse, binding her to a reality slipping through her fingers. Lena's whispered names were a fragile bulwark against oblivion, yet even they began to falter. Captain Reed's pragmatism was a cold beacon in the growing storm, but even he could not escape the island's creeping silence. The clash between survival and scientific obsession was no longer theoretical light, was the battle for their very souls. As the first stars blinked uncertainly through the fog, a question hung heavy in the air. Could reason and caution contend with a force that erased not just bodies, but the very essence of memory and identity? The island waited, its tides rising, swallowing names and histories, beckoning with a silence that promised to consume all. And somewhere deep inside, the survivors knew that the night ahead would bring a reckoning from which none could turn away. Dr. Evelyn Hart sat hunched over her battered journal, the nib of her pen scratching furiously against the paper. Words poured out in a desperate tide, her mind racing to capture every detail before it to slipped away. Around her, the usual chorus of island sounds had all but vanished. The waves no longer crashed with their familiar roar, but instead whispered faintly, as if swallowed by an invisible hand. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a living thing that pressed against their minds and souls. Evelyn's eyes darted up, scanning the camp where her team moved with slow, uncertain steps. Marcus Lynn sat alone by the edge of the shore, his gaze fixed on the horizon, hands trembling slightly. She could see the confusion etched across his face, a growing void where his certainty had once been. His leather jacket, usually a shield of confidence, hung loosely on his frame, as if even his body was starting to forget its own shape. "Marcus," Evelyn called softly, but the name felt foreign on her tongue, as if the word itself was fading. He turned slowly, eyes glassy and distant. I don't remember why I'm here," he admitted, voice cracking. "What are we even doing on this island?" The question was a dagger to Evelyn's heart. She forced herself to nod, swallowing the tightening knot in her throat. "We're studying the island, trying to understand it, but it's changing us, erasing us." Not far away, Lena Carr crouched beneath the skeletal branches of a dead tree, her pale hands trembling as she whispered words no one else could hear. The language was fractured and broken, syllables slipping away almost as soon as they formed. She clutched a small notebook to her chest, her fingers tracing lines of text she had painstakingly recorded from the island's silent whispers. Each name she spoke seemed to push back the encroaching oblivion, but only briefly. "It's like the island doesn't want to be known," Lena murmured, voice barely audible. "It wants to be forgotten." Captain Jonas Reed stood apart from the others, his rugged face set in a grim line as he surveyed the grey horizon. The fog rolled in thicker now, swallowing even the sound of the wind. His naval attire was damp, clinging to his weather-beaten frame. Despite his stoic demeanor, Evelyn could see the worry deep in his eyes, man accustomed to commanding the seas, now powerless against a force he could neither fight nor understand. Dr. Samuel Ortiz paced near the equipment tent, his thin frame tense as he adjusted his glasses. His usual cynicism was tempered by growing unease, the cracks in his skepticism widening with each passing hour. He muttered under his breath, challenging the group to hold on to reason, even as his own certainty faltered. The silence deepened, a living veil that crept into every corner of their minds. Conversations grew sparse, words chosen carefully before they slipped away like sand through fingers. The simple act of naming a tree, a rock, a face-bee, came a desperate ritual to anchor themselves. Evelyn's journal was filling faster than ever, a patchwork of observations, fears, and fading memories. Yet, with every page, she felt the pull of the void stronger, as if the island was reading her thoughts and erasing them in real time. Night approached with the slow inevitability of a tide. The campfire's glow flickered weakly, shadows stretching and shrinking like living things. Mira, Chen, and Eli Turner sat close, their whispered discussions about the island's strange ecosystems dissolving into silence. Nia Brooks shivered nearby, clutching a recorder, her eyes wide as she tried to capture sounds that seemed to vanish before they could be stored. Evelyn caught Marcus's eye across the fire, and for a moment, a spark of recognition flickered. He nodded faintly, a silent promise to hold on. But when he looked away, the doubt returned, thick and suffocating. "We have to remember," Evelyn said, voice steady but strained. "Our names, our purpose. If we lose that, we lose everything." A sudden gust swept through the clearing, snuffing out the flames and plunging them into darkness. The silence pressed in, dense and suffocating. Evelyn's breath caught, heart pounding like a trapped bird. In that moment, the island was no longer just a place. It was a forcer creeping tide of oblivion, washing away the very essence of who they were. As she fumbled for a flashlight, the last words she heard were whispered by Lena from the shadows. "Name it, or be forgotten." Evelyn's fingers tightened around her pen. She would name, she would remember. Because, if she didn't, there would be nothing left, not for her, not for any of them. The erosion of self was underway, and the island's silence was winning. The next hours bled into a harrowing blur. Evelyn's journal became her lifeline, pages filling with frantic notes, sketches of the shifting landscape, and desperate pleas to remember. Every dawn brought new losses, forgotten memories, lost skills, fragmented sentences. Marcus struggled to recall his geology training. Lena's whispers grew quieter, her hands shaking as she tried to hold on to the language she'd uncovered. Captain Reed barked orders to keep the camp secure, but even his voice faltered, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. "We're unraveling," Dr. Ortiz confessed one morning, rubbing his temples. "This isn't just memory loss, it's identity decay." Evelyn's eyes stung with tears she refused to shed. "We have to fight it. Hold on to who we are, no matter what." But how, when even the simplest words slipped away? when the island's silence seeped into their bones, erasing names, histories, and faces. The creeping terror was no longer a shadow at the edge of their minds. It was a suffocating presence, a darkness swallowing the light of their existence. And Evelyn, the steadfast leader, found herself questioning if survival was possible when the self itself was under siege. As the chapter closes, the team's struggle deepens. The island's silence is no longer passive. It is an active predator, a tidal force eroding the very foundation of memory and identity. Evelyn's obsessive recordings stand as a fragile bulwark against the void. But the question lingers: how long before even these last fragments fade into the all-consuming silence? The island waits, patient and unyielding, as the erosion of self continues. Before her lay a moss-covered stone tablet, half buried in the earth, its surface etched with symbols so worn they seemed nearly swallowed by time. The air around her was heavy, still, pierced only by the distant cry of unseen birds and the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a tentative breeze. Fingers trembling, Lena traced the curling lines of the ancient script, whispering fragments of forgotten languages under her breath. "These markings," she murmured, "they're not random. This is a language, no, a record of the people who came before." Her delicate voice barely rose above a whisper, but the weight of her words rippled through the small gathering. Evelyn approached quietly, her sharp eyes narrowing as she knelt beside Lena, the familiar determination settling over her features. "Show me," Evelyn urged softly, her usual confident tone tempered by awe. Lena lifted the tablet slightly, revealing a jagged break at its base and a scattering of smaller shards embedded in the surrounding soil. The relic felt impossibly heavy with meaning, a tangible link to the island's lost past. "They vanished," Lena said, her voice catching, "or were erased." Marcus, standing nearby, shifted uneasily. "Vanished, erased. That's just superstition. We need evidence, not stories whispered by the wind." His words were sharp, cutting through the reverent silence, and Evelyn's gaze flickered with a mixture of frustration and resolve. "We're here because the island defies our understanding," she said quietly. "Dismiss the impossible at your peril." The rest of the team gathered around a shallow pit Lena had uncovered earlier that morning. Broken pottery shards, brittle bones, and fragments of woven fabric lay scattered in the moist sand, half swallowed by creeping roots and salt-stained earth. The relics bore marks of a past civilization, one swallowed by the tides and time, forgotten by the world, and now reclaimed by the island. Dr. Ortiz stood apart, arms crossed and lips pressed into a thin line, his pale face drawn tight. "Even if these are real," he argued, "it doesn't explain the psychological effects we're experiencing. This is a place that preys on the mind, not just a historical curiosity." Evelyn nodded, rubbing her temples as a wave of exhaustion washed over her. But what if it's both? What if the island's power is tied to its history, to the people it consumed? The tension between them was palpable, the fragile harmony of scientific inquiry fraying at the edges. Marcus shook his head, stepping forward. "We can't let fear cloud our judgment. We map, we record, we analyze. That's how we survive." "And what if survival means accepting things beyond analysis?" Lena's voice was steady despite the turmoil in her eyes. "If this island embodies forgotten histories, then our presence here is a disturbance. Maybe naming and remembering is our only defense." Captain Reed stood silent at the edge of the camp, his gaze fixed on the fog that rolled in from the shore like a living thing. The sea's rhythmic tides whispered a haunting lullaby, swallowing sound and light in equal measure. His weather-beaten face was unreadable, but the stoicism he wore as armor was beginning to crack beneath the weight of the island's mystery. That evening, the camp was shrouded in uneasy quiet. The relics were carefully catalogued, their presence a constant reminder of the island's enigmatic past. The scientists huddled over their notes and instruments, but beneath their professional facades, doubt gnawed at their resolve. "We're chasing shadows," Ortiz muttered to Evelyn as the last light faded from the sky. "And the more we chase, the more we lose ourselves." Evelyn's fingers hovered over her recorder before she finally pressed play, her voice steady but laced with fatigue. Day 21. The island reveals more of its secrets, but also its dangers. We find evidence of previous inhabitants, lost peoples whose stories were swallowed by time and tide. The question remains, can we uncover the truth without becoming part of this erasure? Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the stars and dimming the moon's pale glow. Somewhere in the distance, a faint whisper, a language lost to all but the island, trailed through the night air, a chilling reminder that some histories refuse to be forgotten. Yet, as the team grappled with these revelations, fractures deepened. Marcus's impatience clashed with Lena's cautious rituals. Ortiz's skepticism collided with Evelyn's desperate hope. The island's silence grew heavier, pressing in on their minds, threatening to unravel the fragile threads that bound them together. The relics were more than artifacts. They were fragments of a past that refused to die, echoes of lives erased but not extinguished. Each discovery was a step deeper into the island's heart and closer to the edge of oblivion. The scientists faced a choice: to hold fast to reason or surrender to the creeping terror that sought to dissolve their very selves. As midnight approached, the island seemed to pulse with a quiet hunger. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of salt and decay, and the faintest murmur of voices long silenced. In that moment, the island was no longer just a place. It was a living testament to forgetting, a silent sentinel guarding its forgotten names. And the team's fate, like those before them, hung precariously in the balance between memory and oblivion. The night deepened, and with it, the questions grew louder. How much could they remember before they too became fragments of the past? How long before the island claimed them, erasing their names from the world as if they had never existed at all? In the shadows, the island waited, patient and eternal. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of the beach, the coarse sand cold beneath her boots, her breath visible in the chill air. The oppressive silence was unlike anything she had ever encountered, as though the island itself absorbed every sound before it could reach her ears. Then, from the swirling mists, shapes began to emerge, ghostly outlines that flickered at the periphery of her vision. Silhouettes formed like half-remembered shadows, shifting and wavering between the tangible and the spectral. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of dread and fascination rooting her in place. Behind her, the rest of the team gathered with cautious urgency. Captain Jonas Reed, his face weather-beaten and lined with the experience of decades at sea, scanned the horizon with narrowed eyes. Dr. Marcus Lynn's usual bravado was replaced by a tense stillness, his worn leather jacket pulled tight against the damp cold. Lena Carr clutched a small notebook, her pale fingers trembling as she whispered fragmented words from a language long lost to time. Dr. Samuel Ortiz stood apart, arms crossed, skepticism etched into his thin features, but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "What are they?" Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she focused on the figures shifting, fleeting, as if the island itself breathed them into existence. They were not quite human, nor fully intangible, caught between states like memories half remembered. The realization settled cold in her gut. These were echoes, remnants of those who had come before, swallowed by the island's relentless tide of oblivion. Later, in the solitude of her tent, Evelyn's hands trembled as she opened the worn, leather-bound journal of her mentor, Dr. Anne Carraway. The pages were yellowed with age, ink faded but still legible. Her mentor's handwriting traced the margins, filled with notes on strange phenomena, eerily reminiscent of their own ordeal. Memories surged on Bidenen's disappearance on a remote expedition, the whispered warnings she left behind, the guilt that had driven Evelyn to push boundaries. "You warned me," Evelyn whispered to the empty room, her voice thick with sorrow. "But I had to know. I had to understand." Outside, the fog thickened, muffling even the faintest sounds. Captain Reed's voice cut through the quiet as he approached, firm but laced with concern. "Evelyn, this place is changing us. We need to be careful. We can't lose ourselves out here." She met his gaze, nodding slowly. "I know, but giving up means letting the island win. We have to hold onto memories, two names, to each other." At the water's edge, Lena knelt, her voice a fragile thread weaving through the silence. She spoke in the lost language she had uncovered, hoping to anchor the fleeting shadows with names and meaning. The silhouettes paused, almost listening, before dissolving back into the mist. The island was alive, not merely a place, but a force that devoured identity and memory, manifesting its hunger through these ghostly forms. The team's fear deepened, but so too did a fragile hope. If naming these shadows could slow the erasure, perhaps there was a way to resist the silence. Yet the cost was clearage. Moments spent on the island tightened its grip, pulling them closer to oblivion. As night fell, the fog did not lift. Instead, it pressed closer, thickening around their camp like a living shroud. Evelyn sat by the flickering lantern light, clutching her mentor's journal, the words a lifeline and a curse. Outside, the shadows stirred once more, waiting, watching. The island had whispered its warnings. Now, it demanded reckoning. But as the morning sun climbed higher, a subtle shift in the air prickled the skin of the expedition team. A warning unspoken yet deeply felt. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood near the water's edge, her eyes scanning the horizon where the sea met the island's jagged shore. The tides, which had always been a slow, rhythmic pulse, now surged with an unnatural aggression. Waves crashed higher, their frothing crests swallowing the rocks and sand with a hunger that unsettled even the most seasoned among them. "We need to secure the camp," Evelyn called out, her voice cutting through the growing silence that seemed to smother the usual ambient sounds of waves and wind. The team scrambled, their movements frantic as they gathered equipment, tied down tents, and barricaded entrances. Captain Jonas Reed barked orders to the crew, his rugged face tight with concern. The sea was no longer just a backdrop, was an adversary. Marcus Lynn, ever restless and driven by curiosity, lingered at the edge of the camp, his gaze drawn to a fissure in the ground that had appeared overnight. The island's terrain was shifting beneath their feet, unstable and alien. Without waiting for permission, Marcus ventured closer, his worn leather jacket flapping against the rising wind. He knelt by the edge of the fissure, inspecting the cracked earth and the strange, brackish water pooling within. "Marcus, be careful," Lena Carr called softly, her pale face obscured partially by strands of light hair. Her voice was tinged with anxiety, a reflection of the dread creeping through the team. But Marcus was already moving deeper into the ravine the island had formed, eyes wide with a mixture of scientific zeal and reckless abandon. Suddenly, the ground beneath him crumbled a sharp, unnatural fracture and he tumbled backward, plunging into the cold, murky water below. The tide, swelling with unnatural speed, began to pour into the crevice, threatening to trap him. "Marcus," Evelyn shouted, dropping her clipboard as she rushed forward. The roar of the tide mingled with the pounding of her heart, the silence around them now a suffocating void that swallowed sound and hope alike. The team formed a frantic line, hands grasping for the struggling figure, pulling him from the water's icy grasp just before the ravine closed behind them. Sputtering and pale, Marcus gasped for breath, his usual bravado replaced by raw terror. The near-fatal encounter was a stark awakening, a brutal reminder that the island was not simply a place to be studied but a living force bent on their erasure. Around them, tents lay half-submerged, instruments floated adrift, and the creeping silence pressed in, eroding the edges of their sanity as surely as the rising tide consumed their camp. Evelyn's voice, though strained, carried a fierce resolve. "We hold on, we name everything, we remember, we survive." But even as she spoke, the island answered with a whispering wind and the relentless surge of the tide, a reminder that their battle was only beginning. The salt and the silence were closing in, and the team was caught between the two, fighting to anchor themselves in a fading reality. Night fell with a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the distant crash of waves and the ragged breaths of survivors. The island's erasure was no longer a distant threat, it was here, tangible and terrifying, washing away not just their surroundings, but the very essence of who they were. As the camp lay in ruins and the team huddled close, the question echoed through Evelyn's mind: how long before the tide claimed them all? The tide came in that night, relentless and unforgiving, and with it, the chilling realization that the island's silence was not a void, but a force, one that would consume everything, including the memories and names that defined them. The battle for survival had become a battle against oblivion itself. The jagged cliffs that had loomed solid and unyielding the day before now seemed to quiver at the edges of vision, their familiar outlines fuzzing like wet charcoal smeared across a canvas. Evelyn Hart's eyes scanned the horizon with a mixture of fierce determination and exhaustion. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped open her notebook, the pages filled with careful notations and sketches, anchors in a sea of creeping oblivion. "We have to keep naming." Lena's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried across the campfire's crackling embers like a fragile chant. She sat cross-legged on the rocky ground, pale fingers tracing invisible symbols in the air. Her light hair fell forward, veiling her face, but her eyes shone with a strange intensity. "If we don't, we'll lose ourselves entirely." Around them, the team gathered in wary clusters. Marcus Lynn's leather jacket looked out of place against the island's shifting, spectral landscape. He paced near the shoreline, kicking at the sand, his sharp eyes darting nervously between the water's edge and the dense fog that curled inland like a living thing. "This isn't survival," he muttered, voice rough with frustration. "We're just delaying the inevitable." Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "Delaying is better than surrendering. If we don't fight for our names, our memories, the island will erase us without a trace." Captain Jonas Reed stood a little apart, his rugged face illuminated by the firelight. Years at sea had taught him to trust his instincts, but this place confounded logic. The silence here wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence itself, pressing down like a weight on the chest. He folded his arms, watching the scientists with a mixture of skepticism and growing concern. In the center of the camp, Lena began her ritual. She whispered the names of the island's features: the Saltstone Ridge, the Whispering Grove, the Tide's Reach. Each word was a thread woven against the fabric of erasure. Then she named each person softly but firmly: Evelyn, Marcus, Jonas, Samuel, Mira, Eli, Nia. The effect was subtle but undeniable. For a few fleeting moments, the oppressive silence seemed to waver, as if the act of naming summoned a flicker of presence back into the world. Evelyn's fingers tightened on her pen, committing each name to paper, her voice lowering into a steady cadence as she repeated the cycle. "We're fighting with words," she said, voice hoarse but resolute. "If the island wants to erase us, we'll resist by remembering." Dr. Samuel Ortiz leaned forward, glasses catching the firelight. His usual cynicism was tempered now by exhaustion and fear. "It's a fragile defense," he warned. "The mind can only hold on for so long when the reality around it shifts like sand." Myra Chen nodded, her gaze flickering toward the strange bioluminescent algae that glowed faintly in the tide pools. "The island's ecosystem is unlike anything we've seen. It's as if life itself here is entwined with forgetting." Eli Turner checked their equipment again, static crackling through the radio despite the silence. "Communications are patchy. If this keeps up, we might lose contact with the outside world entirely." The team's fragile hope was tested as they moved through the day. Landmarks shifted unpredictably, trees that had stood firm vanished only to reappear elsewhere. Footprints in the sand were swallowed by tides that behaved with unnatural intent. Each time Lena named the features, the landscape seemed to stabilize, if only briefly. Marcus's restless energy became more apparent. During a survey along the beach, he challenged Evelyn's cautious approach, his voice rising in frustration. "We can't just sit here whispering names. We need to push forward, map the island, find its source." Evelyn's reply was calm but firm. "Every step forward risks losing more of ourselves. Without anchors, we'll drift into nothing." Their argument left a fissure in the group's unity. Some sided with Marcus's urgency. Others clung to Evelyn's methodical resistance. The island's silence deepened, swallowing their voices and fraying their connections. As dusk fell, the campfire became a fragile hearth against the encroaching darkness. Captain Reed's steady presence offered a semblance of order, but even he felt the island's pull. The silence was no longer just external, lit seeped into their minds, threatening to undo the very fabric of who they were. Lena's whispered naming continued into the night, a litany against oblivion. Evelyn recorded every name, every detail, her handwriting growing erratic but determined. "We are here," she murmured to herself. "We exist." Yet, as the stars blinked coldly overhead, the island waited, patient and eternal, its tides poised to reclaim all that dared to remember. The struggle was far from over, and somewhere in the silence, the island listened. End of. Within the dim confines of the common area, the team gathered, but the usual hum of scientific discussion had been replaced by a strained quiet. Words hesitated on the edges of lips, as if the silence itself was a living force, pressing in and smothering their voices before they could fully form. Evelyn Hart sat at the worn wooden table, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced the rim of her metal cup. Her sharp eyes scanned the faces around her, faces marked by exhaustion, confusion, and a creeping blankness that no amount of reason could dispel. She tried to speak, to rally the group with a few carefully chosen words, but the sentences faltered, dissolving into uneasy murmurs. The island's silence was not just an absence of sound. It had become a palpable weight, thickening the air and fraying the fragile threads that held the team together. Across the room, Captain Jonas Reed stood near the entrance, his weather-beaten face set in a hard line. Years at sea had taught him to read the subtle signs of a crew on edge, and his instincts screamed that this was no ordinary fear. He moved deliberately, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor as he approached Evelyn. "We need order," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We can't let this place get inside our heads." Evelyn nodded, though the knot of doubt tightened in her chest. The island's influence was creeping beyond the physical realm, attacking their minds and eroding their very sense of self. The team's cohesion was slipping through their fingers like grains of salt lost to the tide. Meanwhile, in the makeshift laboratory, Dr. Samuel Ortiz sat hunched over a cluttered desk. His pale fingers clutched a pen as he scribbled notes in a shaky hand. The skepticism that had once grounded him was unraveling, replaced by a gnawing despair. The scientific rigor he championed now felt like a fragile shield against an overwhelming void. His glasses slipped down his nose as fragmented thoughts scattered through his mind, each more elusive than the last. It's all slipping away," he muttered to himself, eyes darting to the window where shadows danced with the flickering light. The silence outside was no longer neutral. It was accusatory, a reminder of their impending erasure. Back near the camp's edge, Mira, Chen, and Eli Turner exchanged anxious glances. Myra's dark hair was pulled tight into a bun, her eyes sharp despite the weariness. Eli, with his tousled blonde hair and grease-stained shirt, shifted uneasily beside her. Strange noises had begun to echo faintly from the dense trees, a whispering rustle that defied explanation. "Did you hear that?" Myra whispered, her voice barely audible. Eli nodded, swallowing hard. "It's like the island itself is breathing, watching us, waiting." Their shared fear forged a fragile bond, a tenuous tether in the face of the encroaching silence. Yet even this connection felt threatened by the island's relentless tide of oblivion. As the hours crawled by, the team's interactions grew more disjointed. Conversations were punctuated by long pauses, eyes avoiding contact, words left unsaid. The island's oppressive quiet was fracturing their relationships, turning allies into strangers and friends into phantoms of memory. Captain Reed's attempts to impose discipline met with resistance. Exhaustion and fear had eroded the authority he once commanded. Dr. Ortiz's despair became contagious, seeping into the group like a slow poison. Evelyn struggled to hold on to her leadership role, her analytical mind battling the chaos that threatened to consume them all. Amid the unraveling bonds, the island loomed like a spectre, its shifting terrain and creeping silence, a constant reminder that their ordeal was far from over. The very act of communication, once their greatest strength, had become their greatest vulnerability. In whispered tones and fragmented thoughts, the team clung to the fragile hope that naming, speaking, and remembering might anchor them to reality. But as the night deepened, the question lingered in the stale air. How long could they resist the tide before they too were swept away, forgotten, silent, lost? Evelyn's gaze flicked to the fading horizon beyond the camp, where the restless sea mirrored the turmoil within. The island's silence was no longer just a phenomenon to be studied. It was a predator, stalking their minds and hunting their souls. And the fraying connections among the team were the first casualties. The night pressed on, thick with dread and uncertainty. Somewhere in the shadows, the island whispered its ancient, forgotten names they could barely recall, and soon might never remember at all. But even as the darkness threatened to consume them, a spark of defiance flickered within Evelyn's heart. She would not let the silence win, not without a fight. The fragile threads of memory and trust might be unraveling, but she would cling to them with every breath. "We have to stay together," she murmured, voice steady despite the storm inside. No matter what this place does, we hold on to each other. A fragile promise in a world unraveling. But for now, it was all they had. And as the island's tide of oblivion lapped ever closer, the battle for their very souls began anew. By midday, a dense fog crept from the shore, swallowing the landscape in a ghostly embrace. Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of the camp, her breath misting in the cold air as she peered through the grey veil. The world beyond had dissolved into a uniform, indistinct greyness, as if reality itself had been drained of its colours and contours. "It's coming in fast," Marcus Lynn called out, his voice tentative as he emerged from the mist, his worn leather jacket damp with moisture. He squinted ahead, trying to discern shapes that might guide them back to base camp. Evelyn nodded, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crawling along her spine. "Stay close, don't wander off." But the fog was an unyielding force, swallowing sound as greedily as it did sight. Conversations dwindled to murmurs, then to silence. Even footsteps seemed muted, their echoes absorbed into the thick air. The island had become a void where the normal rules no longer applied. Lena Carr moved cautiously, her pale hair damp against her forehead, whispering under her breath, "Namar, Namar," the ancient word, lost to time but recovered from the island's silent language, was her anchor. She clutched a small notebook, its pages filled with the fragile hope that naming the unnameable could stave off forgetting. But even as she whispered, the fog swallowed her voice, leaving only a tentative hum that barely reached her own ears. Captain Jonas Reed's rugged figure loomed through the mist, his naval attire soaked through. "Evelyn, the men are getting restless. Visibility's down to a few feet. We need to pull back before someone gets lost." Evelyn's eyes flicked to the compass in her hand, its needle trembling erratically as if confused by the island's strange influence. "We can't retreat yet, not without more data. We need to understand what this fog is, what it's doing to us." Dr. Samuel Ortiz adjusted his glasses nervously, his thin frame rigid with tension. "It's psychological, Evelyn. Collective hallucination or mass hysteria induced by isolation and stress. We should prioritize safety over speculation." "Maybe," Evelyn said, but uncertainty lingered beneath her words. She felt it too, the creeping fog not only around them but inside their minds. Memories fluttered like fragile moths, flickering and fading before they could be grasped. The camp was a tangled maze of tents and equipment, shadows blurred into obscurity by the fog's relentless advance. Myra, Chen, and Eli Turner kept close, their faces etched with quiet worry as they monitored instruments that now seemed useless. Nia Brooks clung to Lena's side, her eyes wide with unspoken fear. Suddenly, a muffled scream pierced the fog, distant and distorted. Evelyn's heart leaped. Marcus, he appeared moments later, breathless and pale. "I got turned round," he admitted, voice trembling. "The ground shifted door, maybe I just lost my bearings. I swear the trees moved." Evelyn reached out but hesitated, her fingers trembling. "We have to stay together. This fog, it's not natural. It's erasing us, bit by bit." Marcus swallowed hard. "I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I'm forgetting things, names, faces, even why we came here." The words hit Evelyn like a blow. She pulled her journal from her pack, the pages already cluttered with frantic notes and sketches. Lighting a lantern, she scribbled furiously, her handwriting jagged and uneven. Each word was a desperate attempt to tether herself to reality, to keep the island's silence at bay. Outside, the fog deepened, a living entity pressing in from all sides. The muffled sound of footsteps, whispered names, and half-remembered phrases floated in the air, only to be swallowed before they could be fully heard. Lena's voice rose in a fragile chant, the ancient language slipping from her lips like a prayer. She clutched a small carved token, a relic recovered from the island's forgotten past, as if it could ward off the erasure creeping into their minds. Evelyn's gaze met hers, a silent plea passing between them. "Hold on," she whispered, though even her own words sounded uncertain. Hours passed like this time, stretching and folding in on itself. The team's cohesion unraveled as confusion and fear took root. Dr. Ortiz's skepticism gave way to whispered doubts. Captain Reed's authoritative voice cracked as he struggled to maintain order. At one point, Evelyn found herself alone, the fog pressing in so close she could feel the damp chill on her skin. Her journal lay open on the ground, pages fluttering despite the still air. She knelt, trembling, and traced the words she had written, searching for a thread of clarity in the chaos. "I am Evelyn Hart," she murmured to herself, voice barely audible. "I am here, I remember." But even as she spoke, the memory felt fragile, slipping like sand through her fingers. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, Lena, eyes wide and frantic. "The names," she whispered. "We must say them. Say them out loud, or we disappear." Evelyn nodded, rising unsteadily. "Then we speak. We name everything. The trees, the stones, the tides. We fight the silence with our voices." Together, they began to chant the names they knew, clinging to the fragile bonds of language and memory. The fog seemed to pulse with their words, a dark tide that ebbed and flowed with every syllable. But the island was patient. It waited in the silence that followed, a reminder that oblivion was never far behind. As night fell, Evelyn's lantern cast long shadows on the fog-choked ground. She looked to the horizon, where the faintest glimmer of light promised dawn and, perhaps, a fragile hope of escape. Yet, deep inside, she knew the island's silence was far from broken. The fog would return, and with it, the slow, terrifying erasure of all they were. And in that silence, even names would be forgotten. "Evelyn," Marcus said softly, stepping close in the dim light, "how do we keep from becoming ghosts?" She looked at him, eyes fierce despite the exhaustion. "By remembering, by holding on to who we are, even when the island tries to steal it all away." But as the fog thickened once more, swallowing their voices and shadows alike, the answer felt as elusive as the island itself. But it was the names that followed, stolen beneath the tide's cold, merciless wash. Lena Carr felt it first, a shudder of loss that twisted her breath into a whispered plea as she sat cross-legged on the damp earth beside the campfire. "Marcus," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread in the thick stillness. The name felt slippery, as if it might unravel at any moment. Her pale fingers trembled as she traced the outline of the word in a worn notebook, scrawled hastily on pages that fluttered like the last remnants of a dying flame. Around her, the island exhaled its quiet hunger. The fog, thick and wet, pressed close, swallowing sound and light with a slow, relentless appetite. The usual chorus of waves and wind was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that gnawed at the edges of thought. Lena's heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against the silence that threatened to erase even its own presence. She looked up, catching Evelyn's sharp gaze across the firelight. Evelyn sat rigid, her dark hair pulled back, face etched with lines of exhaustion and resolve. She was muttering to herself, a litany of observations and names, the scientific terms that anchored her fragile grasp on reality. Coordinates, Evelyn said aloud, voice hoarse but fierce. The island doesn't exist on any map, but we have to map it ourselves. Every name, every landmark, it's the only way. Marcus stood nearby, his leather jacket hanging heavy on his shoulders despite the warmth of the fire. His usual bravado was cracked, replaced by a raw edge of fear. If we lose our names, he said, voice rough, what's left of us? Just ghosts in this place. Lena nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had spent hours whispering fragments of lost languages, piecing together syllables from the island's silent past. The words felt like fragile lifelines, anchors thrown into the abyss. Naming slows it, she said, voice barely above a whisper. If we can name the island, its features, ourselves, maybe we can resist. Evelyn's eyes flickered with a mixture of hope and desperation. Then we name everything. We speak it aloud, over and over. We fight the silence with sound. The group gathered closer, voices rising in fragile unison. They named the trees, the rocks, the strange plants that twisted unnaturally in the fog. They called out their own names, repeating them until the words cracked and frayed. But even as they spoke, the island pushed back a slow erasure that crept beneath the skin of memory. One by one, the edges of their identities frayed. Marcus stumbled mid-sentence, eyes wide with panic as the sound of his own name slipped away. What's my name? He gasped, grasping at the empty air. Evelyn grabbed his arm, steadying him. You're Marcus, she said, voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. You're still here, but the reassurance rang hollow. The island's power was not just to silence sound, but to hollow out existence itself. In the encroaching twilight, Lena knelt by a pool of black water, its surface mirror still and cold. She stared down at her reflection, the pale face framed by light hair, eyes wide and haunted. Lena, she whispered, willing the name to stick, to root her here. The water rippled faintly, distorting her image. For a moment, the name felt as fragile as a shell tossed by the tide soon to be swallowed whole. Captain Jonas Reed paced near the edge of the camp, his weather-beaten face shadowed by the fog. His steady presence had been a bulwark against chaos, but even he seemed fraying at the edges. This island is a trap, he muttered, voice low and grim. It doesn't want us here. Evelyn approached, her gaze steady despite the turmoil inside. Then we fight it, she said. With everything we have left, the night deepened, the fog curling inward like a living shroud. Voices grew faint, names trailing off into silence. The island's erasure was absolute, a creeping tide that washed away not just memory but the very essence of being. Yet amidst the fading echoes, Lena's whispered words lingered, a fragile defiance against oblivion. We are still here, she breathed. We are still named, but the island answered only with silence. And the forgotten names drifted like salt on the wind, lost forever beneath the tide. The remnants of the camp lay scattered, a fragile testament to a team fraying at the edges. Evelyn stood stiffly near the central clearing, her dark hair pulled tight back from her sharp features, eyes burning with a mixture of exhaustion and mounting dread. Across from her, Marcus paced with restless energy, the worn leather of his jacket creaking as he moved, his short-cropped hair damp with sweat. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the distant lapping of unnatural tides against the shore. Evelyn's voice cracked as she finally spoke. Marcus, this reckless exploration is tearing us apart. You're pushing us deeper into danger without regard for the consequences. Marcus's eyes flickered with defiance, his tone sharp and raw. And standing still is safer, waiting to be swallowed by this place. I'm trying to map it, to understand it before it erases us completely. You want caution, but that's paralysis. It's not caution, it's survival, Evelyn shot back, stepping closer, her voice low but fierce. Your bravado won't save anyone here. We're losing ourselves, our memories, our names. If you keep pushing, we'll lose everything. The argument spiraled quickly, voices rising, breaths coming in ragged gasps. Tensions that had simmered for days erupted, exposing raw wounds beneath professional facades. Marcus accused Evelyn of clinging to control, haunted by her past failures, while Evelyn countered that Marcus's impulsiveness was a death sentence. Nearby, Lena retreated silently into the shadows at the edge of the trees, her pale face hidden beneath strands of light hair. Her lips moved in a barely audible whisper, threading together fragments of lost words she'd pieced from the island's silence. Naming the unnameable had become her fragile lifeline, a way to anchor herself against the creeping forgetfulness. Captain Jonas Reed stood apart from the storm, his rugged, weather-beaten face stoic as he surveyed the fracturing team. His naval attire was worn and smeared with dirt, but his posture remained disciplined. He understood the futility of the argument, but knew that without order, they would all fall into chaos. Enough, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. We need to work together, or none of us leave this island. Dr. Samuel Ortiz, the team psychologist, removed his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes, the thin frames trembling in his grasp. His skepticism, once a bulwark against superstition, was crumbling under the island's relentless assault on sanity. We're unraveling, he muttered, voice hollow. This place, it's not just erasing memories, it's erasing us. Evelyn's gaze shifted from Marcus to Ortiz, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. The island's tidal terror was no longer just a physical threat, was a psychological abyss pulling them under. The blame and guilt swirling between her and Marcus were symptoms of a deeper fracture, one that threatened to consume them all. Marcus's jaw clenched, eyes darkening with a mix of fear and defiance. We can't let it win. We have to fight it together. Fight. Evelyn's voice broke, the years of trauma and loss surfacing in a rare moment of vulnerability. I lost my mentor to something like this. I swore I wouldn't let it happen again. But we're losing more than just people. We're losing ourselves. The fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the clearing as if the island itself leaned in to listen. Words hung heavy in the air, a fragile truce forming amid the ruins of trust. Yet beneath it all, the creeping silence persisted on, invisible tide eroding their minds, their bonds, their very existence. As night fell and the island's dark breath deepened, Evelyn and Marcus stood at a crossroads. Their conflict was no longer just between two scientists, but a battle for the soul of the team. A desperate struggle to hold on to identity when everything was slipping away. Outside the clearing, Lena's whispering grew softer, a litany against oblivion. Captain Reed's steady presence remained a beacon, though even he could not deny the island's relentless pull. Dr. Ortiz's eyes closed briefly, the thin line between sanity and madness razor thin. In this breaking point, the island's true terror revealed itself, not just as a place of vanishing land and forgotten names, but as a force that could unravel the very fabric of human connection. As Evelyn and Marcus faced each other once more, the question lingered in the cold air. Could they overcome their fractures, or would the island claim them all in silence? And somewhere beneath the tides, the island waited, patient and inevitable, as the erasure continued. The whispers had grown louder in recent hours, indistinct murmurs that the others could barely hear, but that Lena had begun to decipher in fits and starts. She pressed her lips close to the earth, her breath mingling with the mist as she muttered fragments of an ancient tongue, words that felt simultaneously alien and achingly familiar. "Listen," Lena urged, her voice barely a whisper but brimming with urgency. "These are not just sounds, they're remnants. Pieces of voices long swallowed by the tide." Evelyn stood nearby, her sharp eyes scanning the shifting fog that curled like smoke around their camp. The island had always been a paradox, an entity as much as a place, existing just beyond the grasp of understanding. Tonight, that truth seemed to crystallize with terrifying clarity. "What do they say?" Evelyn asked, stepping closer, the weight of leadership pressing down on her weary shoulders. Lena's fingers trembled as she spoke. "They speak of erasure and preservation. This island, it is a repository, a silent vault of all that has been forgotten. Names, histories, lives, everything washed away by the tide of oblivion, but it preserves them in the silence. It is both destroyer and guardian." Marcus shifted uneasily, his leather jacket rustling as he paced. "So it's like a tomb, a place that buries everything it touches." "Not just a tomb," Lena replied. "A memory, too, but one that demands we forget to exist." The words hung heavy in the mist. Captain Jonas Reed, standing apart near the shoreline, stared out into the dark waters, his face carved by years at sea. The tide whispered secrets only he seemed to hear. "A silent sentinel," he murmured, "watching over things better left forgotten." Suddenly, the whispers swelled into a chorus, spectral voices rising and falling like the ocean itself. The team instinctively drew closer, the island's silence pressing in like a living thing. Evelyn's heart pounded as she realized the full scope of their predicament. The island did not merely erase their memories, demanded obliteration to maintain its own existence. "We can't just run from this," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "We have to understand it. If we can name it, grasp its nature, maybe we can find a way to resist." Lena nodded, eyes wide but resolute. "Naming is power here. Each forgotten word we speak slows the tide, anchors us. But the island fights back. It doesn't want to be remembered." Marcus swallowed hard, the flickering shadows of lost memories clouding his gaze. "What happens if we fail?" The silence answered with a cold gust that swept through the camp, snuffing out the faint glow of their lanterns. In that moment, the island's dual nature was undeniable, a guardian of forgotten histories, but a merciless force demanding oblivion. The team stood at the edge of a precipice, caught between the terror of erasure and the slim hope of survival through memory and language. The island whispered still, its voice a chilling reminder of what was at stake, their very existence, poised on the knife's edge of forgetting. As the night deepened, Evelyn steeled herself. The battle was no longer just scientific inquiry. It was a fight for identity, for the right to be remembered. "We hold on," she declared. "By names, by stories, by every shard of memory we can grasp. We fight the silence with our voices." And in the gathering dark, their whispers rose a fragile defiance against the tide of oblivion. Lena's hands moved deftly over the scattered relics they had uncovered days earlier, fragments of pottery etched with symbols that pulsed faintly under the moonlight. She traced the lines carefully, her lips forming the lost syllables that had once given these shards meaning. "These aren't just artifacts," she said softly. "They're echoes, imprints of lives consumed by the island. Each one a story swallowed by time." Evelyn approached, the weight of her past failures a silent companion. Her mentor's disappearance haunted her still, a ghost woven into the fabric of this island's mysteries. Yet here, Faced with the island's sentient erasure, she felt the faint stirrings of purpose rekindled. "Then we must speak their names," Evelyn said. "Bring them back, even if only for a moment." The others gathered, voices low but resolute. One by one, they named the vanished landmarks, the forgotten peoples, the lost histories. The island seemed to pulse in response, the oppressive silence momentarily lifting as if acknowledging their plea. But the reprieve was fragile. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, spectral silhouettes that whispered warnings in tongues older than time. The island was listening, and it was not pleased. Marcus clenched his fists, the terror of oblivion tightening its grip. "We're not just fighting the island," he muttered. "We're fighting the silence inside ourselves." Captain Reed's steady presence was a bomb, but even he could not mask the growing dread. The ocean tide crept closer, a reminder that the island's erasure was relentless and inevitable. As dawn threatened the horizon, the team faced a grim truth. To survive was to remember, to speak, to name, but every word risked drawing them deeper into the island's consuming silence. The whispers promised secrets, but demanded a terrible price. And so, beneath the waning stars and the ever-hushing tide, they prepared for the choice that would define their fate, a choice between fading into oblivion or standing defiant, voices raised against the salt and the silence. The island waited, patient and eternal, as the whispers of oblivion curled around them once more. Her fingers hovered tremblingly over the controls, reluctant to stop the faint crackle of voices and footsteps preserved on the tape. It was a fragile tether, a thread binding her to a reality that was slipping away like sand through desperate fingers. Outside, the tide whispered with unnatural intent, the waves folding over themselves with a sinister rhythm that seemed to pulse from the island's very heart. Marcus had been the first to vanish in plain sight. One moment he was near the shoreline, mapping the jagged rocks that seemed to rearrange themselves even as he marked them down. The next, a low fog had rolled in so thick it swallowed sound and form alike. Evelyn remembered the wild panic in his eyes, the way his lips parted as if to call out his own name, and then nothing. No scream, no echo, no trace left behind. It was as if the island had reached out with invisible hands and plucked him clean from existence, erasing every sign that he had ever been there. She pressed the replay button again, the tape's hiss filling the cramped room. Lena's soft voice came through, whispering words Evelyn could barely catch, ancient syllables that seemed to resist the silence. Lena had found a way to slow the erasure, naming. But even naming was a fragile shield against a force that consumed histories and identities with indifferent hunger. Outside, Captain Jonas Reed stood motionless at the edge of the camp, staring out at the dark horizon where Marcus should have been. His face, weather-beaten and stern, betrayed a grief he refused to voice. The pragmatic man who had kept the team grounded now wrestled with an impossible truth. The island was not just a place, but a sentient force that erased, devoured, and forgot. The loss was not only physical, but existential. Evelyn's gaze drifted to Dr. Ortiz, who sat slumped against the wall, his sharp mind unraveling in the face of something science could not explain. His skepticism had crumbled, replaced by a hollow terror that gnawed at his reason. The island's silence was no longer just the absence of sound, but the obliteration of being. In the dimming light, Lena knelt by the dirt outside, her pale fingers tracing shapes she struggled to name before the silence could swallow them. Her eyes, wide and haunted, caught Evelyn's for a brief moment, a silent plea for connection, for remembrance, for survival. The island's tide was rising, threatening to sweep away the last fragments of their identities. Evelyn forced herself to stand, clutching the recorder like a lifeline. "We have to hold on," she whispered to the empty room, "or we'll be lost too." But as the shadows deepened and the silence thickened, the question lingered. How do you fight to exist when the very fabric of your being is being unraveled? The night crept closer, the island preparing to vanish once more into the void it had always inhabited. And with it, the last memories of those who dared to step onto its shores would slip away, forgotten like names erased from a page smeared by relentless tides. Evelyn's voice cracked as she spoke into the recorder one final time. "If anyone finds this, remember us. Remember that we were here." The wind carried the words out into the creeping fog, swallowed instantly by the silence that claimed them all. The edge of forgetting was not a place, but a moment, and that moment had come. The island's core was shrouded in a dense mist, curling and twisting like the tendrils of forgotten memories. Every step she took was muffled by the thick fog, the ground beneath her feet pulsing faintly as though breathing, alive with a slow, sinister rhythm. Her breath came in shallow gasps, heart hammering with a mixture of dread and stubborn resolve. Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she clutched the worn, leather-bound journal, the pages inside filled with her obsessive notes and accounts of the island's slow erasure. The creeping silence had swallowed so much already: names, faces, histories, and yet here, in this liminal heart of the island, she sensed the presence of something far older, far more terrible than mere natural phenomena. The whispers began as barely audible murmurs, curling around her like ghostly fingers. They were fragments of language, lost words, and half-remembered names, an elegy for the forgotten. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself. "I am Dr. Evelyn Hart," she whispered aloud, her voice trembling but clear. "We seek understanding, not destruction." Out of the fog, spectral silhouettes emerged, shapes half-formed, flickering like fragile memories struggling to maintain form. They hovered along the shoreline beyond the mist, their outlines blurred and ghostly. These were the echoes of those who had been consumed by the island's relentless tide of oblivion, lost souls whose histories had been erased from time. Their silent presence pressed on Evelyn's heart, an aching sorrow that threatened to unravel her resolve. Behind her, faint footsteps approached. Marcus and Lena had followed, their faces pale and drawn, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. Marcus's usual bravado was gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability that mirrored Evelyn's own. Lena clutched a small collection of artifacts, fragments of language and culture she had painstakingly pieced together, hoping to anchor their identities against the island's erasure. "Evelyn," Marcus whispered, voice cracking, "are you sure this is the right way? What if the island, it's more than we can handle?" She met his gaze, dark eyes fierce despite the exhaustion. "We have no choice. We need to know what it is, why it exists. If we can't understand it, we can't fight it." The mist thickened, swallowing the edges of the landscape, the island seeming to breathe around them. A low hum vibrated through the earth, a pulse that synchronized with the rising tide not of water, but of silence itself. Evelyn stepped forward, raising her voice in a trembling chant of names. Words Lena had taught her, fragments of a lost language that seemed to slow the erasure, if only briefly. As she spoke, the island responded. The ground beneath her feet shifted subtly, the fog swirling faster, coalescing into shapes that hinted at history and memory. The whispers grew louder, no longer just echoes, but a chorus of voices, ancient, mournful, warning. The island was a manifestation of forgotten peoples, a place born outside the flow of time and memory, a repository for those the world had abandoned and erased. Suddenly, A surge of the tide swept over the island's edge. The water was black and still, swallowing footprints and whispered words alike. The spectral figures flickered violently, their forms distorting as if struggling against an invisible current. Evelyn felt a wave of vertigo, the edges of her vision blurring as the island's power pressed inward, threatening to pull her under. "Hold on to who you are," she murmured fiercely, gripping the journal tightly. "Remember your names. Remember everything." Captain Jonas Reed appeared then, his rugged face etched with grim determination. "Evelyn, we can't hold this any longer. The tide's turning against us." Dr. Ortiz stood beside him, eyes wide behind his glasses, the skepticism that had once shielded him now eroding under the weight of fear. "What does it want from us?" Evelyn swallowed hard, the terrifying truth settling like cold salt water in her chest. "To erase us all, to preserve its silence. But if we can confront it, if I can reach whatever's left inside, we might find a way to save what's left of us, or at least understand what we're facing." The island's fog closed in, the spectral silhouettes reaching out in silent lament. Evelyn felt the pull of oblivion, the seductive promise of nothingness that erased pain but also erased being itself. She took a deep breath, stepping further into the mist, her voice rising in a defiant chanter, lifeline cast into the swallowing silence. The air shimmered, the island's sentience stirring as if waking from a long dream. In that moment, Evelyn glimpsed the horror beneath the beauty, the centuries of lost lives, erased histories, and forgotten names that gave birth to this place. The reckoning had come, and with it, the final choice between surrender and sacrifice. As the tide rolled inward once more, she called out to her team, her voice steady despite the quake in her heart. "Hold fast. Remember who you are. We fight for our names, for our stories. We fight for the silence to be broken." Beyond the mist, the island waited, patient and eternal, a sentinel of oblivion. And Evelyn Hart, lead scientist and survivor, stood on the precipice of a truth no map could chart, a truth that would decide not just their fate, but the fate of memory itself. The silence deepened, but within it, a spark flickered, fragile, defiant, and unyielding. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood at the jagged edge where salt water met earth, the cold biting at her exposed skin despite the heavy jacket she wore. The sea was a glassy abyss, swallowing light and sound, the silence around her profound and suffocating. Above, the moon, obscured by moving clouds, cast a pale, uncertain glow that shimmered on the creeping mist. Behind her, the remnants of their camp lay scattered, half-forgotten equipment, discarded notes, and the whispers of lives slowly slipping away. The island was winning. Its erasure was no longer a creeping threat, but an overwhelming tide, consuming not just their memories, but their very existence. Evelyn's breath came in shallow bursts, each exhale a visible ghost swallowed by the cold air. She turned to look back at the others, Lina, Marcus, Captain Reed, and Dr. Ortiz, all caught in the same battle for identity and survival. The once confident team was fractured, their minds frayed by the island's relentless assault. Lina knelt beside the flickering remains of their makeshift fire, whispering words from the lost language she had painstakingly pieced together. Her fingers trembled as she traced symbols in the dirt, invoking names and shapes that seemed to push back the silence, if only briefly. "We have to hold on," Lina said, her voice barely above her breath. "Naming is our shield." Marcus paced near the shoreline, his leather jacket damp and torn from his desperate trek through the island's shifting terrain. His eyes were wide with guilt and panic, haunted by the near-fatal misstep that had almost cost him his life. "This place, it's changing faster than we can keep up," he muttered, voice cracking. "If we lose everything, what's the point?" Captain Reed stood rigid, his rugged face etched with worry but his stance steady. "We'll find a way. We have to." Dr. Ortiz, ever the skeptic, had grown silent, his thin frame slumped as though the weight of doubt had finally crushed him. Even his sharp mind had begun to unravel under the island's insidious influence. Evelyn's gaze drifted back to the dark waters swirling before her. The island was more than land, it was a living force, a sentient entity born from forgotten histories and erased identities. It consumed to preserve its silence, a paradox that defied all scientific understanding, and now it demanded a price. "There's only one way," Evelyn said quietly, turning to face the group. I have to give myself to it, to anchor what remains." The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Marcus's eyes widened. "No, Evelyn, there has to be another way." She shook her head, her dark hair falling loose around her face, eyes burning with a fierce determination. "If I don't, we'll all be lost. The island will erase us completely. But if I do, the island might hold back, preserve fragments of us memories, names, identity." Lena reached out, her pale hand trembling as she grasped Evelyn's arm. "You're our anchor. Without you, we drift into oblivion." Evelyn swallowed hard, the weight of past failures pressing down on her, the lost mentor, the expeditions that ended in silence and disappearance. This was her reckoning. With measured steps, she approached the water's edge. The fog thickened, curling around her like a living thing, swallowing sound and light. From within the mist, spectral shapes, flickered faces, and forms of those forgotten by time. Their eyes empty voids, reflecting the endless silence. Evelyn lifted her voice, steady and clear, speaking the words Lena had taught her, names long buried beneath centuries of loss. She offered herself to the island's silence, a sacrifice to hold back the tide of erasure. The fog coiled tighter, the spectral forms reaching out like desperate hands. Her body felt weightless, the world dimming at the edges. Yet inside, a fierce spark remained: hope, memory, identity flickering against the encroaching dark. Back at the camp, the others felt the shift. The oppressive silence eased, just enough to breathe, to remember. Lena's whispered names grew stronger, Marcus's frantic energy tempered by a fragile calm, Captain Reed's steady hand guiding them through the fading night. But the cost was clear. Evelyn was gone, swallowed by the island's depths, her sacrifice the fragile anchor holding their fading existence together. As the tide receded, the island seemed to pause, as if contemplating its next move. The survivors clung to the fragile threads of memory and identity, aware that their struggle was far from over. In the silence that followed, the island whispered promise and a threat that oblivion was patient, and the cycle of erasure would continue. Evelyn's last words echoed in their minds, a haunting refrain that would carry them forward. Remember us, before the silence claims all. The night held its breath, waiting for the dawn that might never come. The story did not end here. It was only another beginning, a fragile stand against the inevitable. And in that stand lay the last, flickering hope of survival. But as the island's tide whispered ever closer, the question remained: how long could memory withstand the salt and the silence? The island waited, and the silence deepened. Evelyn Hart sat hunched against the gnarled trunk of a dying tree, the battered notebook pressed tightly to her chest, as if it were a talisman against the creeping void. Her breath came shallow and uneven, each inhale a tremulous thread weaving her to the fraying edges of reality. Around her, the remnants of the expedition were scattered equipment half buried in shifting sands. Tents sagging under the oppressive fog, and the faintest trace of footsteps fading into the earth like whispered secrets lost to time. She lifted the notebook, its pages a fragile mosaic of observations, sketches, and hastily scribbled notes. The ink had begun to smear, the words bleeding into one another like memories dissolving into forgetfulness. Yet within those pages lay the last bastion of their existence, a fragile archive against the island's relentless erasure. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she traced a familiar sentence, the words anchoring her to a past that was slipping away. From the edge of the clearing came a whisper, soft and tentative, threading through the silence with a fragile resilience. Lena Carr emerged from the fog, her pale face partially obscured by the light strands of hair that clung to her cheeks. She moved with deliberate care, the weight of anxiety etched into her every step. In her hands, she held a small collection of notes, fragments of a language lost to time, a key to the island's silent enigma. Evelyn, Lena's voice rose barely above a breath, a fragile thread woven from determination and despair. I've been repeating the words again and again. It's the only way I can hold on. Naming the island, the trees, even the silence itself. It's like we're fighting the tide with language. Evelyn nodded, her eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and resolve. I've been recording everything, she whispered, but it feels like the island is swallowing the very essence of us. Our memories, our voices, even our names. The two women sat together beneath the heavy sky, their shared presence a fleeting beacon in the encroaching darkness. They spoke in hushed tones, the cadence of their voices weaving fragile anchors against the abyss. Lena recited the lost words she had painstakingly pieced together, and Evelyn responded with fragments of her notes, their dialogue a fragile bridge spanning the gulf of forgetting. As the fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the camp, Evelyn felt the boundaries of her own identity blur. Faces of her colleagues flickered like shadows in her mind, names dissolving into silence. The weight of her past, the mentor she had lost, the failures that haunted her felt both distant and unbearably close, entwined with the island's malevolent will. "Do you remember your name?" Lena asked suddenly, her voice trembling. Evelyn paused, the question striking deep. "I think so," she replied uncertainly, clutching the notebook tighter, "but it feels like it could vanish at any moment." Outside their fragile sanctuary, the island's shoreline began to melt into mist. Spectral figures flickered at the water's edge, ghostly silhouettes of forgotten souls swallowed by the tides of oblivion. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating, erasing sound and substance alike. Lena's gaze fixed on the horizon. "If we disappear," she said softly, "will anyone remember us? Or will we become just another forgotten name, lost in the salt and the silence?" Evelyn reached out, taking Lena's hand in hers. "Maybe that's all we can do. Nor remember each other, hold on to the fragments before they slip away." They sat together as the last light drained from the sky, the island's erasure drawing inexorably closer. Memories frayed and slipped like grains of sand through their grasp, but in that moment of shared clarity, they found a fragile solace. The silence deepened around them, a vast and unyielding tide. Yet within it lingered the echo of human connection, a whispered defiance against the void. The island would soon vanish from all maps and minds, its existence erased like a forgotten dream. But for now, Evelyn and Lena held fast to the last memories, their voices a fragile ripple in the vast ocean of silence. As darkness closed in, they knew the inevitability of oblivion, yet refused to surrender without a final act of remembrance. The wind carried their whispered names across the empty shore, a fleeting testament to lives once lived, to stories once told, and to the unyielding human need to be remembered in the face of the salt and the silence. And as the first light of dawn approached, the island began its final disappearance, leaving behind only the faintest trace of a fading memory, a ghostly echo lost to the tides of time. But within that silence, a question remained. Would the story end here, or was there some fragment, some whisper that could survive beyond the erasing tide? The answer lingered, just beyond reach, as the last memories slipped quietly into the void. Evelyn Hart stood at the prow of the ship, the wind tugging at her dark hair, now streaked with grey and salt. The sea lay flat and cold, a mirror reflecting nothing but the empty sky above. The island, once so vivid with strange life and shifting shadows, had begun to dissolve, its edges blurring into the creeping mist that rolled in with unnatural silence. She glanced at the antique watch strapped tightly around her wrist, the seconds ticking down with a cruel finality. Midnight approached, the moment when the island would vanish from all maps, charts, and memory, a creeping erasure that had already stolen so much from them all. Around her, the ship's deck was hushed, the remaining survivors clinging to the fragile bonds that tethered them to sanity. Inside the cramped cabin, Lena Carr sat hunched over her notebook, the dim lantern casting flickering shadows across her pale face. Her fingers trembled as she scribbled the last fleeting names and words the team had clung to, a desperate attempt to anchor what was slipping away. The island's silence pressed against her like a living thing, a weight that threatened to crush the fragile threads of memory she so carefully preserved. Every whispered name was a defiance against oblivion, a fragile shield against the void. Captain Jonas Reed stood at the helm, his rugged face etched with lines of disbelief and rising panic. The compass in his hand spun wildly, as if the island's disappearance had torn a hole in the very fabric of reality. No chart, no digital record, no satellite image, nothing showed the island's existence anymore. It was as if it had never been. His hands clenched the wheel tighter, knuckles white, as the ship drifted toward the endless black horizon. Evelyn's voice broke the silence, calm but edged with urgency. We have to remember. We have to hold on to who we are. If the island can erase itself, it will try to erase us too. Lena looked up, eyes wide and haunted. I keep trying to name it, to speak the forgotten words. It slows the silence, but I don't know if it will be enough. The survivors gathered on the deck, a small, trembling circle of humanity against the engulfing dark. The last light of the island flickered like a dying ember, swallowed by the abyssal night. Voices fell to whispers, names uttered as prayers against the encroaching void. The salt air was thick with the weight of loss and the terror of being forgotten. Evelyn's mind raced back to the beginning, the excitement, the hope, the fierce determination to uncover the island's secrets. Now, all that remained was a haunting silence, the echo of forgotten names dissolving into the tide. She gripped the railing, feeling the chill seep into her bones, and whispered a vow to the night, to survive, to remember, to resist the erasure. As the clock struck midnight, a final wave of stillness swept over the ship. The island was no longer there. No trace remained on any map or memory beyond their fragile minds. The world outside would never know they had been, and soon even they might forget. The silence deepened, absolute and terrifying. But in that silence, Evelyn found a flicker, a stubborn ember of defiance. The battle was not over. As long as they breathed, as long as they named, the island's vanishing point would not be the end. And somewhere beneath the waves and the silence, the tide waited to return. The night hummed with a quiet intensity. The survivors moved like ghosts, shadows among shadows, their faces drawn and pale. Captain Reed's voice was hoarse as he called out, "All hands, prepare to weigh anchor. We leave at first light." Evelyn nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon where the blackness swallowed the last flicker of the island's form. "We'll carry it with us," she whispered, "in memory, in names, in silence." Lena's lips moved in a silent chant, a litany of lost words and forgotten names. She traced the lines of an ancient script in the air, a fragile bridge between existence and oblivion. The ship's engines groaned to life, breaking the eerie stillness. As they pulled away, the water closed behind them, erasing the island as if it had never been. The world beyond waited and changed, unaware and forgetful. But the survivors knew the truth. The salt and the silence had claimed their home, their past, and threatened their very selves. And as the darkness stretched before them, they faced the vast unknown, where memory was a fragile island in a sea of oblivion. Evelyn clasped Lena's hand, her voice steady despite the fear. "We are still here, for now." The vanishing point was not the end. It was a beginning shrouded in silence, waiting for the next tide. Outside, the ocean whispered secrets in waves that no one could hear. The island had vanished, but its story lingered silent, haunting, and eternal. Slowly, imperceptibly, the threads that connected the expedition to reality frayed and dissolved, as if the island's silent tide reached beyond its shores to seep into the fabric of collective memory itself. Dr. Evelyn Hart sat alone in a dim university office, the glow of a failing lamp casting long shadows over scattered reports and fragmented recordings. Her fingers trembled as she traced the faded ink on a brittle map, one that no longer bore the island's name. The data streams she once controlled had been overwritten, erased like footprints washed away by an indifferent sea. The faces of her team, their voices once vibrant in her mind, now echoed faintly, like whispers carried on a wind she could no longer grasp. Outside, in a coastal town miles from the ocean's edge, old fishermen gathered at the local tavern, their conversations thin with superstition and awe. "Have you heard about the island that vanished?" One whispered, eyes darting to the window as if expecting it to reappear. Another shook his head, voice low and trembling. "It's just a ghost story, passed down from those who never came back. A place that swallows names and memories," they say. These murmurs were the only remnants of a truth too vast to be contained in spoken word or written page. The island had become legend, a spectre haunting the edges of human understanding. Meanwhile, Lena Carr found herself submerged in the musty depths of an archive room, surrounded by crumbling tomes and manuscripts that seemed to sigh with forgotten histories. She ran her fingers over ancient script-scurved symbols and broken glyphs that unnervingly resembled the lost language she had fought to preserve on the island. Each character was a fragile echo of a people erased from time, their stories swallowed by the island's silence. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and despair. These fragments might be the key to understanding, yet they also embodied the overwhelming futility of remembrance. At dusk, the seashore lay bathed in fading light, the tide lapping softly against sand etched with indistinct footprints. The ocean carried whispers, forgotten names, memories of lives erased into the vast unknown. Evelyn walked the shoreline, the salt wind biting at her skin, her mind a tempest of loss and longing. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a presence itself, thick and suffocating, pressing against her consciousness with the weight of oblivion. The fading of the expedition from collective memory was the island's final conquest. Scientific discoveries transformed into ghost stories, languages into unintelligible symbols, memories into myths. The island's power transcended physical erasure. It seeped into the human psyche, eroding the very foundations of identity and existence. Evelyn's obsessive recordings, Lena's whispered translations, Captain Reed's pragmatic resolve, Dr. Ortiz's skepticism all became mere shadows in a world increasingly unwilling to remember. Yet, amid the encroaching silence, faint embers of resistance glimmered. The act of remembering, of naming, of speaking the unspeakable, persisted as a fragile defiance against the tide. The expedition's legacy, though blurred and fragmented, lingered in the hearts of those who dared to recall, however faintly. As night deepened, Evelyn's thoughts turned inward. Was it possible to hold on to something so ephemeral as memory when the very world conspired to forget? Could the human need for connection and meaning withstand the relentless pull of oblivion? The silence beyond the island was not emptied, was alive, a living echo of all that had been lost and all that might yet be reclaimed. And as the tide whispered against the shore, carrying with it the last fragments of forgotten names, Evelyn understood that some stories, though buried, never truly vanish. They wait, hidden beneath waves of silence, for a voice brave enough to speak them once more. In this place where memory and myth entwined, where the boundaries between reality and oblivion blurred, the expedition's echoes endured, fragile, haunting, and eternal. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood alone at the bow of the ship, her dark hair whipping around her face as the cold wind tugged at her clothes. The setting sun bled hues of crimson and violet across the horizon, but it was the subtle movements beneath the waves that held her attention. There, in the fading light, the water pulsed with a cadence that was at once familiar and profoundly alien, a silent rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of a vanished island. For weeks, since the island had disappeared from all maps and digital records, the crew had been trying to make sense of the lingering signs. The island itself was gone, vanished without a trace, but its presence clung stubbornly to the ocean around them. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she traced the patterns of the currents with a practiced gaze. There was something unnatural here, something that defied the laws of nature and science alike. Behind her, footsteps approached. Captain Jonas Reed joined her silently, his weather-beaten face etched with concern. He was a man of the sea, grounded in pragmatism and experience, yet even he could not dismiss what the crew had been witnessing. "The instruments keep showing irregularities," Jonas said quietly, nodding toward the ship's navigation console. "Currents shifting without cause, depth readings that don't add up. It's like the sea itself is alive, and it's hiding something." Evelyn didn't reply immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the horizon, where the ocean seemed to ripple with a barely perceptible pulse. "The island's not gone," she murmured. "Not really. It's out there, somewhere, in the tides. It's woven into the water itself, a cycle we don't yet understand." Below deck, Mira Chen was bent over her samples, her fingers stained with salt and seaweed. The marine biologist had been the first to notice the strange bioluminescent patterns flickering beneath the surface organisms that glowed with unnatural rhythms, as if responding to some silent command. "It's like they're signaling," Mira said when Evelyn came down to join her, her voice barely above a whisper. "The marine life. It feels like it's carrying the island's memory, a trace of its existence embedded in the currents." Evelyn nodded slowly, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on her shoulders. The island was not simply a place that had vanished. It was a force, a presence that transcended physical form. Its erasure was not an end, but a transformation, a slow, creeping seepage into the ocean's pulse, an echo that might one day swell into something far more terrifying. Night fell swiftly, wrapping the ship in a cloak of stars and shadow. The crew gathered on deck, their faces pale in the moonlight as the ocean's usual sounds faded into a profound, unsettling silence. Even the waves seemed to hold their breath. Evelyn broke the silence with a soft, urgent whisper. "The tide will return. The island's cycle isn't over. We thought we escaped oblivion, but oblivion has reached deeper than we imagined." The stillness pressed in around them, a tangible weight of dread and anticipation. The island's legacy was not a closed chapter, but an open wound, bleeding into the currents and tides that shaped their world. And somewhere, beneath the waves, the silent terror waited, patient and eternal. As the ship cut through the black waters, the crew could only wonder and fear what the next tide might bring. The ocean's restless pulse was a constant reminder of the island's haunting presence. Evelyn found herself drawn to the rail night after night, watching the water shimmer with unnatural light. The bioluminescent creatures beneath the surface flickered in patterns that resembled ancient symbols. Lena had once tried desperately to decipher symbols that spoke of cycles, erasure, and return. Captain Reed's pragmatism was tested daily, his logbook filled with notes of strange navigational anomalies, inexplicable fog banks that rolled in without warning, and the eerie silence that swallowed radio signals whenever they neared the coordinates where the island had once stood. "We're caught in its wake," Jonas confessed one evening, his voice low and serious. "Not just the island itself, but whatever force it is. It's like we're trapped in a loop." Mira's scientific curiosity warred with growing unease. The marine ecosystems were unlike anything recorded, shifting and adapting in ways that defied logic. The organisms' glowing patterns seemed to form messages, warnings perhaps, or remnants of a language long erased. Evelyn's mind circled these thoughts relentlessly. The island's cycle was a tidal terror not confined to geography, was a rhythm of oblivion, a slow erasure that began with names and memories and now reached into the very fabric of nature. "We need to document this," Evelyn urged one afternoon. "If the island's essence flows through the tides, then understanding the cycle could be our only defense." But even as they gathered data, the creeping silence thickened. Communication faltered. Words felt inadequate against the weight of the unknown. The ocean's pulse was a lullaby and a warning, a reminder that the island's story was far from finished. One night, as Evelyn lay awake in her cabin, the ship rocked gently on the waves. She closed her eyes and heard it, a faint whisper beneath the roar of the sea, a voice that spoke not in words but in absence. It was the silence of forgotten names, the hush of histories erased, the tide's eternal return. She understood then that the island was not just a place lost to time, but a force that would linger, haunt, and perhaps one day reclaim all that it had swallowed. The cycle of erasure was not a curse that ended, but a story that repeated endlessly beneath the salt and the silence. The dawn would come soon, but with it, Evelyn knew, the tide's return would bring new terrors, ghosts of memory, shadows of forgotten selves, and the relentless pull of oblivion waiting just beyond the horizon. And so they sailed on into the unknown, carried by the sea's haunting rhythm, caught forever in the tide's return. It was a silence so profound, it felt as though the very air was swallowing sound before it could reach any ear. Dr. Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of their camp, eyes scanning the shifting horizon where familiar landmarks once stood firm. Now, the shoreline seemed to dissolve into a mist that flickered with spectral uncertainty, as if the island itself were peeling away layers of reality, leaving nothing behind. Behind her, Lena Carr crouched beside a cracked stone tablet half buried in sand, her pale fingers trembling as they traced the faint outlines of ancient glyphs. Her voice was soft, a whisper barely louder than the breeze, yet it rose in defiance against the creeping void. "Terror," she murmured, "the sea, nail, the wind." Each word was a fragile anchor, a desperate attempt to tether the island's shifting essence to something concrete, something named. Evelyn's gaze shifted to the others. Marcus Lynn stood nearby, his leather jacket dusted with sand, eyes narrowed as he watched Lena with a mixture of skepticism and awe. Captain Jonas Reed paced not far off, his weather-beaten face drawn tight with worry. The silence pressed in on them all, a physical weight that seemed to seep into the marrow of their bones. "Why do you keep saying their names?" Marcus asked, his voice rough, betraying the exhaustion beneath his bravado. Lena looked up, her eyes wide and haunted. "Because if we don't, they disappear. Not just the island, but everything within it. The memories, the histories, the people. Names hold power. They are the last thread connecting us to existence." Evelyn nodded slowly, her fingers clutching the worn leather strap of her journal. "She's right, we've seen it. The more we forget, the more the island consumes. Naming is our resistance." The group fell silent again, the weight of that truth settling like ash. The island was not simply a place, it was a force, an erasure that sought to unravel the very fabric of being. Each forgotten name was a loss, not only of memory, but of self. Night descended with a chill that bit deeper than the sea breeze. Around a flickering lantern, Lena read aloud from her hastily scrawled journal, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This is Dr. Evelyn Hart. This place is called the Salt and the Silence. We remember." Her words floated into the stillness, fragile and defiant. For a few moments, the silence seemed to retreat, as if the act of naming pushed back against oblivion. But the reprieve was brief. Conversations grew terse, memories faltered, and the team's cohesion frayed. The island's influence seeped into their minds, blurring edges of identity and sowing doubt. Evelyn found herself questioning not only the world around her, but her own existence. Who was she if her past could be erased like a tide washing away footprints in the sand? In the quiet moments, Marcus admitted his fears. What if we're already gone? What if this place is just the space between being and nothing? Evelyn's eyes met his, reflecting the same dread. "Then we fight to be more than whispers in the dark. We fight to be named, to be remembered." But even as she spoke, the silence returned, heavier and more absolute. The island waited, patient and inexorable, to reclaim all that dared to trespass into its domain. The chapter closed on a chilling image, Lena's voice rising in a chant of forgotten words, echoing against the void, a fragile testament to the human need for memory, identity, and the names that bind us to existence. The question lingered in the air: how long could they hold on before becoming nothing more than forgotten names themselves? The silence deepened, swallowing hope and sound alike, as the island whispered its ancient, terrible song. And somewhere beneath the salt and the silence, the island listened. The usual sounds of the sea, the rhythmic crash of waves, the distant cries of seabirds were swallowed whole by an oppressive stillness that seemed to shroud the entire island. Her boots sank slightly into the damp sand, but even the faintest scrape against the ground was silenced. It was as if the island itself had swallowed sound, erasing it from existence as effectively as it was erasing their memories. Evelyn's breath came shallow, her dark eyes scanning the grey horizon that melted indistinctly into the fog. The landscape around her was blurred, every edge softened by the creeping mist that seemed to absorb light and sound alike. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her notebook, the words she had obsessively recorded suddenly feeling fragile, as if the ink itself might dissolve into the silence. Behind her, the camp was eerily quiet. Lena's voice, once a gentle murmur of whispered names and lost languages, had dwindled to near silence. Evelyn could hear only the faintest rustle of fabric cleaner sitting huddled in a corner, her pale hair falling over her face as she repeated the forgotten words like a fragile lifeline. Each whispered syllable was a desperate attempt to anchor herself to some fragment of identity before it too was swept away by the tide of oblivion. The psychological weight of the island pressed on them all. Captain Jonas Reed stood at his usual post near the edge of the forest, his weather-beaten face shadowed with uncharacteristic doubt. The stoicism that had anchored the expedition now cracked beneath the relentless silence. His eyes darted nervously into the fog, as if expecting the island's spectral silhouettes to emerge at any moment. Even his steady hands betrayed a flicker of unease when he gripped the rail of a makeshift barricade. In the dim light of the camp's central tent, Dr. Samuel Ortiz paced like a man unraveling, his thin frame tense and restless. His usual sharp wit faltered, replaced by muttered fragments of skepticism and fear. The silence seemed to gnaw at his reason, dissolving the boundaries between scientific logic and creeping dread. His voice, when it came, was a broken whisper swallowed by the void, a testament to the island's erasure of not just sound, but sanity. Evelyn's mind raced, struggling to piece together a strategy to fight what felt like an inevitable descent into nothingness. The island's silence was a manifestation of loss of memory, identity, and history. It was a void that erased not only the present, but also the past, severing the fragile threads that tethered the team to themselves and to one another. She thought back to the earliest days of the expedition, when curiosity and excitement had filled the air. Now, those feelings seemed like distant echoes, fading into the slow, relentless quiet. The island was more than a place. It was a force, a living embodiment of oblivion that consumed names, memories, and ultimately, existence itself. Lena's whispered incantations offered a fleeting resistance, a fragile hope that naming could anchor them against erasure. Yet even those words felt fragile, like sand slipping through desperate fingers. The silence deepened, swallowing their voices, their histories, their very selves. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the ocean, its tides now a muted, ghostly rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the island's erasing power. The sea was no longer a source of life, but a harbinger of oblivion, drawing the scientists ever closer to vanishing. The oppressive quiet wrapped around her like a shroud as she realized the full scope of their predicament. To survive, they would have to confront not only the island's physical dangers, but the terror of complete erasure of fate worse than death, where existence itself was forgotten. Her hands tightened around the notebook, a symbol of her desperate grasp on knowledge and memory. Somewhere within the silence lay the key to resisting the island's tide. But with every passing moment, the silence deepened, and the line between reality and oblivion blurred. The island waited patiently, its spectral fog swallowing sound and memory alike, as Evelyn took a breath and stepped forward into the void. The camp was a shadow of itself. Once vibrant with voices and purposeful movement, it now lay draped in a quiet so absolute it was almost physical. Every attempt to speak was greeted by emptiness. Every gesture felt muted. The scientists were ghosts within their own memories, haunted by the slow erosion of their identities. Lena sat cross-legged near a flickering lantern, her pale fingers tracing the cracked pages of a tattered journal. Her lips moved in silent prayer, whispering names that the island tried to steal. Each word was a fragile act of defiance, a small beacon against the encroaching darkness. But even her whispered voices seemed too thin, fading into the oppressive silence like dying embers. Evelyn watched her, a pang of sorrow twisting her gut. She knew that the island's silence was not merely the absence of noise, but a force that stripped away the very essence of being. The scientists were losing themselves, slipping into an abyss where names, memories, and histories were swallowed whole. Captain Reed's silhouette appeared at the edge of the clearing, his broad frame tense as he scanned the fog. The rugged lines of his face were etched with worry, a stark contrast to his usual calm. He spoke haltingly, his voice a rare ripple in the quiet. "We can't let this silence take us," he said, though even his words seemed to falter before the void. Dr. Ortiz leaned against a tree, his glasses reflecting the dim light. His usual cynicism had given way to raw fear. "It's like the island is rewriting reality," he muttered, eyes darting nervously. "We're becoming nothing." Evelyn nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "We have to hold on to who we are," she said firmly. "Through language, through memory, through connection." But even as she spoke, the silence stretched between them, a vast, gaping chasm that no words could bridge. Night fell with a heavy silence that pressed down on the island like a weight. The fog thickened, swallowing the camp in a grey shroud. Evelyn lay awake, the darkness around her deeper than the absence of light. It was the absence of presence. Her mind drifted, memories flickering like fragile flames. Faces, names, moments of laughter and fear all threatened to vanish. She clutched her notebook tightly, the pages filled with hastily scrawled observations and desperate attempts to preserve reality. Outside her tent, the tide whispered a sound so faint it was nearly imagined. It was the island's heartbeat, a reminder that the erasure was inevitable, creeping closer with every wave. Evelyn's thoughts spiraled into the silence, a meditation on loss and oblivion. The island was a mirror reflecting the terror of non-existence, a place where memories and names were devoured until nothing remained. She whispered a name, her own feeling the fragile thread of identity stretched taut. The silence answered with a void. Morning brought no relief. The fog lingered, a suffocating veil that dulled senses and blurred reality. The island's silence was a living thing, pulsing with a slow, relentless hunger. Evelyn rose, stepping carefully through the damp grass. Her footsteps left no sound, her breath a shallow whisper. She met Lena's gaze, finding in those pale eyes a reflection of her own fear and determination. "We must keep naming," Lena said softly. "It's the only way to hold ourselves here." Evelyn nodded, voice steady despite the trembling inside. "Then we name, we remember, we fight the silence with words." Together, they began to speak, their voices fragile threads weaving a tapestry of sound against the void. The island listened, patient and indifferent, as the silence deepened around them. The battle for memory had become a battle for existence itself. The silence deepened, and with it, the terror of being forgotten. Evelyn's voice broke the quiet once more, a trembling defiance against the abyss. She looked to the horizon, where sea and sky merged into an indistinct grey. "We will not vanish without a trace," she vowed, even as the island whispered its cruel lullaby. The salt air was thick with absence, the silence a vast ocean swallowing all sound, all memory, all hope. And in that void, the true horror lay not in death, but in the slow, inexorable erasure of being. The silence deepened. Evelyn Hart sat hunched over her scattered notes. The pages were stained and torn, each bearing fragments of observations and hastily scribbled theories that now seemed as ephemeral as the memories she desperately tried to hold on to. Outside, the island's persistent fog crept closer, swallowing sound and light with a voracious hunger. Her fingers trembled as she traced the inked lines, the words blurring and slipping away like grains of sand through a clenched fist. Evelyn's sharp eyes, dulled by exhaustion and creeping despair, caught the faintest traces of symbols Lena had painstakingly recorded, ancient glyphs that defied translation but resonated with a strange familiarity. Something about the island's silence was not merely absence, but a presence, a force that manipulated reality itself. "Evelyn," a voice whispered, fragile yet insistent. It was Lena, stepping softly into the tent, her pale hair tumbling over her face like a veil. "I found more of the language. It's incomplete, but it speaks of preservation through forgetting." Evelyn looked up, meeting the quiet urgency in Lena's gaze. "Preservation through forgetting." Lena nodded, her voice barely audible. "The island is not just erasing usets holding memories, histories, but only by letting them fade from the world. It's a paradox." Outside, the wind carried the faintest murmur of waves, but the usual cries of seabirds were absent. The silence was thick, a living entity pressing against their sanity. Marcus Lynn appeared suddenly at the entrance, his worn leather jacket damp with mist, eyes wide and wild. "You need to see this," he said, voice edged with both fear and fascination. The rock formations near the northern cliffs there shifting, not just eroding, but moving. It's as if the island itself is breathing, rearranging its bones. Evelyn rose unsteadily, heart pounding. They followed Marcus in somber procession through the fog, the ground beneath their feet morphing subtly, the familiar becoming alien. Patterns emerge, geological structures that defied logic, spiraling and fracturing in ways that mocked the laws of physics. "Look here," Marcus said, pointing to a jagged crevice that seemed to pulse faintly, a heartbeat beneath the stone. "It's alive, or something like it." The team stood in silence, the weight of revelation settling like a shroud. Dr. Samuel Ortiz, usually the skeptic, adjusted his glasses, voice low and uncertain. "If this is true, then everything we understand is flawed. Our science, our perceptions, they're inadequate for this place." Captain Jonas Reed joined them, his weather-beaten face drawn tight with worry as he gazed out toward the ocean. "The tide's washing away more than just footprints now," he said gravely. "It's erasing us. Our presence, our history soon. Nothing will remain." Evelyn swallowed hard. The island was more than a mystery. It was a force of oblivion, a manifestation of forgotten histories and erased identities. Their efforts to anchor themselves with names, memories, and scientific inquiry were fragile defenses against an overwhelming tide. Back at camp, the air hung heavy with unspoken fear. Evelyn's notes were a patchwork of half-remembered facts and fading impressions. She tried to piece together the island's story, a place born from centuries of lost peoples, a repository of silence that preserved by obliterating. Lena sat beside her, whispering the scattered words of the lost language, each syllable a thread holding the fraying fabric of their sanity. "We're chasing shadows," Lena murmured. "But maybe, in the shadows, there's a truth we can't yet grasp." Evelyn nodded, gaze distant. "Or a truth we're not meant to understand." As the night deepened, the island seemed to pulse with a quiet menace. The creeping silence was a promise and a threat, an erasure, not just of the physical, but of identity and existence itself. The team was caught between the limits of human understanding and the vast unknowable, their struggle an echo of forgotten histories, buried beneath waves and time. Somewhere in the shifting fog, the island waited, patient and eternal, as memories slipped away and the fragile threads of truth unraveled. And as dawn approached, Evelyn knew that whatever fragments of reality remained, they were slipping inexorably toward the edge of forgetting. The island's silence was no longer empty, it was a presence, a challenge, a final riddle that defied all their science and reason. The question lingered in the cold morning air. How do you fight an erasure that consumes not just your body, but your very essence? And in that question, the last flicker of hope battled the encroaching darkness, waiting for the moment when knowledge and oblivion would collide. The fragile balance held by naming rituals, scientific inquiry, and whispered languages was unraveling fast. Each moment on the island stretched the boundaries of their reality, pushing the team to confront the impossible. Evelyn's journal filled with fragmented thoughts and desperate hypotheses, but the truth remained elusive, hidden in the shifting tides, the creeping silence, and the island's living terrain. The island was more than a place, it was a force, an entity born from forgotten histories, a manifestation of oblivion itself. Scientific understanding faltered in the face of its supernatural power, and the team's sanity frayed as memories slipped away like mist. They were running out of time and answers, yet in the fragments of truth they uncovered, there was a haunting beauty, a reminder that some mysteries exist beyond human comprehension, preserved only in silence and forgetting. As the island's fog thickened once more, Evelyn felt the weight of the unknown settle upon her shoulders. The final confrontation loomed, and with it, the ultimate reckoning between memory and oblivion. The island waited, patient and inexorable, ready to reclaim its silence. The island, a cruel phantom, shimmered with unnatural light, its edges wavering between substance and mist. Each breath they took was heavy with salt and silence alike, the oppressive stillness pressing inward, erasing the world with every passing moment. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she clutched a battered notebook, its pages filled with hurried observations, names, and desperate attempts to anchor reality. Lena sat beside her, pale and fragile, her voice barely more than a whisper as she repeated the lost words they had uncovered in the island's silent language. Together, they named the rocks, the trees, the distant silhouettes of forgotten lives. Each syllable a fragile tether against the erasure that sought to swallow them whole. "We have to hold on," Evelyn urged, her voice hoarse, eyes scanning the shifting terrain. "If we lose these names, if we forget who we are, what will become of us?" Lena nodded, her gaze fixed on a crumbling stone arch that had resisted the tide longer than any other landmark. "The silence wants us gone," she said softly, "but as long as we remember, it cannot claim us completely." Behind them, the island pulsed with a living breath, the tides rising unnaturally fast, licking over the edges of their fragile camp. The air was thick with a chilling quiet so profound it seemed to swallow sound itself. Evelyn's heart pounded, each beat a defiant drum against the creeping void. Far off in the distance, the silhouette of Captain Jonas Reed's ship rocked gently on the restless sea. His rugged face was set in a mask of stoic sorrow, eyes never leaving the vanishing landmass that had consumed so many. He understood the gravity of their sacrifice. The island was not merely a place, but a force, a manifestation of forgetting itself. As darkness fell, the island's outline blurred and faded, a spectral mirage dissolving into the night. Evelyn's voice rose, trembling but resolute, as she called out the names of her team: Marcus, Mira, Eli, Nia, Samuel, voices from the past that threatened to vanish like mist. Lena joined her, their words weaving a fragile spell against oblivion. The wind carried their whispers across the empty shore, where spectral figures flickered briefly in the dim light before succumbing to silence. The island's tides surged one last time, washing away footprints, memories, and the very essence of existence. Evelyn felt the pull, the irresistible drag toward nothingness. But she fought with every ounce of will, her mind clinging to the last shards of identity. She knew the cost to remain was to vanish, but to leave was to condemn all to oblivion. Her sacrifice was the final anchor, a beacon of memory in a sea of silence. Lena, clutching the notebook, slipped away under the cover of darkness, carrying with her the fragile legacy of their journey. The island, now nothing more than a ghost on the horizon, disappeared from all maps, records, and minds. Captain Reed's ship sailed into the black waters, the silence left behind a haunting void where the island had been. The world would forget the expedition, the names, the faces, but somewhere beyond memory, in the restless tides and whispered winds, the salt and the silence endured. The story of the island would become myth, a whispered warning of the fragility of memory and the terror of being forgotten. And in that silent abyss between existence and erasure, the final truth remained. To be remembered was to resist the tide, but even memory was fragile, a fleeting flame in the vast, unyielding dark. Evelyn's last thoughts faded with the rising tide, a name whispered into the void, "Remember us." And then, silence.